Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Deku became the architect of the cosmos part 1. If you guys enjoy this what if and want to see part 2, comment down below and let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content and leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. The author of the story, AceFroster from WhatIf. So let's start the video. The Yagi family lived in a city where the miraculous had become commonplace. A world where quirks ruled every aspect of life. People could heal with a touch, control the weather with a thought, or even manipulate fire at will. In this society, quirks weren't just powers, they were the essence of identity, purpose, and potential. They were the key to success and admiration. A world so full of wonder, yet one that often forgot the quiet, the different, the powerless. But even in such a world, there was one constant that remained, a towering, unwavering symbol of hope, All Might. All Might, the symbol of peace. He was a hero whose very presence sent shockwaves of relief across the land. With his golden smile and boundless energy, he had saved countless lives, dismantling villains with ease. His name was known to every citizen, and his legendary status transcended even the quirkiest of individuals. When All Might entered a room, the air seemed to crackle with hope. People felt safer, happier, simply by being near him. His legacy wasn't just one of physical power, it was a message that anyone could be a hero. The world saw him as the pinnacle of what a hero should be. Izuku had been born into this world, a world where his father was a living legend. Yet, despite his father's grandeur, Izuku was not like him. The world of quirks held no magic for him. There was no power he could call his own. He had been born quirkless. Izuku Yagi, son of All Might and 𝐀𝐮𝐭𝐡𝐨𝐫 Yagi, was a quiet child. He grew up watching his father's heroics on the news, seeing the reverence others had for him. All Might's every move was adored, celebrated, and admired by all. His father's iconic stature was impossible to escape, and every person he met looked at Izuku with pity, sometimes curiosity, other times condescension. "You're All Might's son, right?" they'd say, their eyes filled with expectations. Izuku would nod. But deep down he knew, no matter how much he wanted to be like his father, it was impossible. His father's greatness was an unachievable ideal for someone like him. He would never possess the strength to fight, to protect, to inspire others in the same way. Izuku's place in the world felt like a shadow, lingering quietly in the background. His mother, 𝐻𝐿 Yagi, had once been an exceptional hero in her own right. Her gravity-manipulating quirk was nothing short of extraordinary. It allowed her to lift, control, and alter the very flow of gravity around her, giving her unmatched agility and power. But she had given up that life long ago to raise her family. Even so, her legacy remained. Every so often, a glance from an old friend or a retired hero would remind Izuku that his mother was once someone powerful too. Yet despite their impressive quirks, his parents were always busy. Himari, Izuku's younger sister, was the one who was constantly doted upon. Izuku's lack of a quirk had made him an afterthought in a family full of so much potential. His sister was the future, a child born with a perfect quirk. Himari's quirk was light manipulation. She could bend light around her, create brilliant flashes, and even produce destructive beams of concentrated light. To many, she was a prodigy. To her parents, she was everything they had ever hoped for in a child. She could help organize school events, clean up after meetings with ease, and even assist in training programs for young heroes. It was clear to everyone around her that Himari was destined for greatness. And naturally, All Might and 𝐻𝐿 showered her with praise. "Guess what I did today?" Himari exclaimed, her voice filled with excitement as she entered the house that evening. Her quirk sparked playfully around her, turning the mundane into magic. "What is it, sweetie?" 𝐻𝐿 asked, her hands moving to prepare dinner. "I helped organize the chairs for the meeting after school. My light made everything easier for the teachers to set up. And you should have seen their faces when I fixed the lights, just with my quirk." Himari's eyes sparkled as she recounted the day's triumphs, her hands glowing with bright energy. 𝐻𝐿, beaming with pride, looked down at her daughter. "That's amazing, Himari. You're such a big help. You have a bright future ahead of you, just like your father. All Might, towering in the doorway, patted his daughter on the head. That's my girl. You've got the makings of a real hero. Keep it up and you'll go far. Izuku sat quietly at the edge of the table, picking at his food. His thoughts were elsewhere, floating in the haze of his mind. Himari's radiant smile and his parents' glowing praise were like a distant echo, so far out of his reach. They never noticed the quiet, reserved child who sat in their midst. He could barely remember the last time anyone had truly looked at him and said, "Izuku, you're doing great too." Instead, they only ever seemed to notice him when something was wrong. He was the invisible son, the boy who couldn't fit the mold of what society expected from the child of All Might. But Izuku wasn't like the others. Where other kids relied on their quirks, Izuku relied on his mind. He had long since realized that he didn't need a quirk to be great. He could create something better. He could build things that no one else could even dream of. And every day after school, when the world moved on, Izuku stayed in his room, poring over books, diagrams, and old mechanical devices, working tirelessly to find a solution to the problem that kept him up at night. How could he make the world see that he was just as valuable as his sister? How could he prove that, even without a quirk, he had something that could change the world? At just 6 years old, Izuku had begun to develop an obsession with engineering. He had always loved to take things apart: gadgets, toys, broken machines. He could see the inner workings of things that others overlooked. He understood how gears turned, how power flowed, how systems functioned. He understood them in a way that most people couldn't. His first real breakthrough had come when he was 6. His family had been hosting a party, and someone had brought a small drone for the kids to play with. The drone had malfunctioned and crashed into the garden, but Izuku had found it fascinating. He spent the rest of the evening fiddling with the broken parts until he had managed to reassemble it. It didn't work exactly as it had before, but it flew again, barely. It was enough. That small victory had fueled something inside him, a burning need to create, to build, to innovate. His mind was a machine that never stopped. And every day, it grew sharper. Now, sitting at the dinner table, Izuku's thoughts were consumed by his latest project. His mind wandered to a new idea he had been working on for weeks, a device that could manipulate electromagnetic fields. It was a small prototype, nothing compared to the incredible creations of his father or mother, but it was his. It was something only he could understand. Only he could make work. He had spent the past few days experimenting with different materials, designing intricate circuits, and testing magnetic fields. The results had been promising. Soon, he would have something that could alter the environment around him, just like those with quirks. He didn't need a quirk to make an impact. But as the night wore on, the same unspoken truth remained. He was a child of a world full of heroes, a world where everyone had something to offer, but Izuku had nothing to give. At least, that's what it seemed like to those around him. But Izuku knew better. He would prove them wrong. He wasn't going to be a hero like his father, but he would be something better. He would change the world in his own way. And maybe, just maybe, he would find a place where he didn't have to live in the shadow of his family's greatness. School was a battleground in more ways than one. To most students, it was a place of learning where they honed their quirks and prepared for the future. For Izuku Yagi, it was something else entirely: a laboratory. A controlled environment filled with variables, predictable patterns of human behavior that could be analyzed, anticipated, and neutralized. In this world ruled by quirks, where strength and spectacle were glorified above all else, Izuku had already identified the critical flaw in society's design. Strength without intelligence was nothing more than chaos. And chaos, that could be controlled. At school, the Yagi siblings occupied polar extremes. Himari, radiant and charismatic, was the shining star of their class. Her light-manipulating quirk only amplified her natural magnetism, drawing teachers and students alike into her orbit. She excelled in group activities, led class projects, and was widely regarded as the heir apparent to their father's heroic legacy. Izuku, on the other hand, was an enigma. Quirkless and quiet, he drew no praise from teachers or admiration from peers. But neither did he draw their scorn, not directly. The weight of his family name shielded him from outright mockery, but it didn't stop the whispers or the dismissive glances. He didn't care. His classmates were data points, their quirks predictable in their limitations, their behaviors reducible to algorithms of pride, insecurity, and envy. They were tools, each with a use he could exploit if necessary, or obstacles, which could be removed with precision. The lunch bell rang, a cacophony of chairs scraping against tile floors as students flooded the cafeteria. Izuku stayed behind, meticulously arranging his notebook. Each page was a repository of observations, designs, and hypotheses. His latest schematic, a compact energy dispersal module, occupied the forefront of his thoughts. It wasn't his most ambitious project, but it served its purpose. The door slammed open. "Oi, Deku!" Katsuki Bakugo's sharp voice reverberated through the empty classroom. Flanked by his usual lackeys, Bakugo's aggressive swagger filled the space. His red eyes burned with a challenge that needed no words. "Still hiding in here with your stupid toys, huh?" Izuku didn't look up from his notebook. "You're interrupting," he said, his tone devoid of interest. The lackeys chuckled, mistaking Izuku's calm for SBMson. Bakugo's grin widened, but it wasn't amusement. It was the predatory grin of a wolf scenting bee, interrupting. "Nah, I'm giving you a chance to show you're not completely useless." Bakugo advanced, the air around him crackling as sparks erupted from his palms. "You think you're better than me, don't you? Sitting here, playing with your scraps like they mean something. You don't even have a quirk, Deku. You're nothing." Izuku closed his notebook with deliberate precision. The sound echoed in the silence that followed. When he finally met Bakugo's gaze, his expression was as cold and unyielding as steel. "Spare me the theatrics," Izuku said. "Your insecurities are tedious." The room seemed to freeze. The lackeys exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the tension in the air. Bakugo's grin vanished, replaced by a snarl. "What did you say?" "You're predictable," Izuku continued, standing and placing his notebook into his bag. "A blunt instrument, dangerous only to those who can't anticipate your movements. You rely on strength because you lack the intelligence to do otherwise." Bakugo's explosion was instant, a fiery blast aimed straight at Izuku's chest. But Izuku was already moving. The detonation scorched the air where Izuku had stood a split second earlier. With calculated precision, Izuku activated the pulse deterrent concealed on his wrist. The device emitted a targeted sonic burst that scrambled equilibrium. Bakugo staggered, his balance momentarily disrupted. "You think you're so smart?" Bakugo growled, steadying himself. "You can't win against power." Izuku didn't respond. Instead, he retrieved a second device, a flash emitter, and activated it with a subtle flick of his fingers. A blinding burst of light filled the room, causing Bakugo and his lackeys to recoil, shielding their eyes. "Coward!" Bakugo roared, forcing himself to lunge blindly toward Izuku. Izuku sidestepped effortlessly, his movements calculated to maximize Bakugo's momentum. The explosive teenager stumbled forward, his punch missing its mark by inches. Izuku placed a hand on Bakugo's shoulder, shoving him further off balance. "You're over-reliant on instinct," Izuku said, his voice as cold as ever. "It makes you predictable. Sloppy." Bakugo spun, launching another barrage of explosions. This time, Izuku activated a magnetic disruptor from his pocket. The small gadget emitted a focused pulse that interfered with the chemical reactions in Bakugo's sweat-based explosions. The blasts fizzled out harmlessly, leaving only faint smoke trails in the air. The lackeys, still blinded and disoriented, fumbled uselessly in the background. "You're pathetic," Bakugo spat, his face twisted in fury. "You hide behind your stupid gadgets because you're weak." Izuku tilted his head slightly, as though studying a particularly interesting insect. "And yet, here you are, unable to land a single blow." Bakugo lunged again, his rage overriding any sense of strategy. Izuku caught his wrist mid-swing, twisting it just enough to force Bakugo to drop his stance. His green eyes bored into Bakugo's, his grip firm but not malicious. "This isn't a fight," Izuku said calmly. "It's a demonstration." He released 𝐀𝐮𝐭𝐡𝐨𝐫 and stepped back, deactivating his devices. The silence that followed was deafening. 𝐀𝐮𝐭𝐡𝐴's lackeys looked on, uncertain whether to step in or retreat. "This isn't over." 𝐀𝐮𝐭𝐡𝐨𝐫 growled, his voice a mix of anger and frustration. "I'll crush you, Deku. You'll see." Izuku didn't bother to respond. He picked up his bag and walked toward the door, his composure unshaken. The confrontation had served its purpose, testing his devices under pressure and reaffirming the critical flaw in his peers: they lacked control. As Izuku exited the classroom, he passed Himari in the hallway. She was surrounded by a group of friends, her laughter bright and effortless. She caught sight of him but didn't acknowledge his presence. He didn't mind. Their paths, while parallel, rarely intersected. "You okay, Izuku?" one of her friends asked, her tone tinged with mock concern. "He's fine," Himari replied before Izuku could answer. Her tone wasn't cruel, but it carried an air of dismissiveness. "He's used to it." Izuku's gaze didn't waver as he continued walking. Words, like quirks, were just another variable. And Himari's superiority complex. That was merely another obstacle to be managed. At home that evening, the family gathered for dinner. Himari recounted her day with enthusiasm, her parents hanging on her every word. Izuku ate in silence, his thoughts focused on refining his devices. The family dynamic didn't bother him, it was simply another predictable pattern in his environment. After dinner, he retreated to his room. The small space was meticulously organized, each tool and component in its place. On his desk, the prototype for a new project gleamed under the dim light. The world around him was chaotic, flawed, and riddled with inefficiencies. But he would change that, not through brute strength or flashy heroics, but through the one thing that truly mattered: logic. The morning sun filtered through the cracks in Izuku's curtains, casting faint patterns on his workbench. The room was a controlled chaos of blueprints, half-finished gadgets, and meticulously labeled components. A faint hum filled the air from a small device spinning atop his desk, its oscillations emitting a faint blue glow. Izuku adjusted the calibration knob on the device, ensuring the energy output was consistent. It was a refinement of a gadget he'd recently built, a short-range pulse generator that temporarily disrupted electronic signals. Initially flawed due to overheating issues, it now functioned seamlessly after weeks of adjustment. Satisfied, Izuku leaned back and let out a quiet breath. His gaze shifted to the corner of his desk, where a stack of blueprints rested. They depicted devices far more ambitious than anything he'd built so far: an energy amplifier, an automated material recycler, even a conceptual design for an electromagnetic propulsion device. "If only I had the materials," Izuku muttered, his voice tinged with frustration. He ran a hand through his hair, surveying the modest components scattered across his desk. He'd exhausted his resources weeks ago. His parents wouldn't provide funding for what they considered unnecessary distractions, and buying the materials himself was out of the question. He stood, pocketing the pulse generator, and grabbed his bag. "One step at a time," he said quietly to himself. The day passed in a haze of routine. Teachers droned on about quirk applications and hero regulations, topics that barely registered with Izuku. His mind was always elsewhere, running simulations, solving equations, imagining the possibilities of his next creation. It wasn't until the lunch bell rang that reality intruded. 𝐀𝐮𝐿 and his lackeys cornered him near the back of the schoolyard, their shadows falling over him like storm clouds. "Oi, Yagi!" 𝐀𝐮𝐿 barked, cracking his knuckles. "Still hiding behind your little toys." Izuku, who had been jotting notes in his notebook, didn't bother to look up. He remained calm, his pencil gliding across the page. "What? Too scared to face me without one of your gadgets? You think you're so smart, don't you?" 𝐀𝐮𝐿 snarled, his voice rising. Izuku finished his line and snapped the notebook shut with a precise motion. He tucked it into his bag and finally looked up, his expression unreadable. "Your approach is predictable, 𝐀𝐮𝐿," Izuku said evenly. "I've told you before, brute force isn't the only way to win." 𝐀𝐮𝐿's scowl deepened. "Shut it. You're just a quirkless loser hiding behind scraps of metal." The lackeys snickered, but there was a hesitation in their laughter. They'd seen this before. Izuku reached into his pocket, retrieving the pulse generator. Its sleek design reflected the sunlight as he turned it on with a subtle flick of his thumb. "You've tried this approach countless times," Izuku said, his tone cool and clinical. "And each time, the outcome is the same. If you were capable of learning from your mistakes, you'd have realized by now." Bakugo's face twisted with anger. "I'll blow that thing to pieces, you little—" Before he could finish, Izuku pressed the button. A sharp pulse radiated outward, and Bakugo stumbled, clutching his head as his equilibrium wavered. His lackeys staggered, their balance thrown off by the disruption. Izuku didn't wait for them to recover. He slipped past them with the same deliberate composure he always had, leaving Bakugo seething behind him. The rest of the school day was uneventful, save for the occasional glares Bakugo shot his way. Izuku paid no mind. He had long since stopped letting such things bother him. As the final bell rang, signaling the end of the day, Izuku packed his things with practiced efficiency. On his way out of the classroom, he heard familiar voices from around the corner. "Today's the day," Bakugo muttered, his tone low but venomous. "We'll wait for him near the alley by the park. He won't see it coming." "Yeah," one of his lackeys chimed in. "Let's see him try to squirm his way out of this one." Izuku paused just long enough to catch the gist of their conversation. He adjusted his bag strap and turned in the opposite direction. "They're nothing if not persistent," he murmured, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He had no interest in dealing with another ambush from Bakugo's group, so he decided to explore a different path. The idea of walking into another one of Bakugo's traps was tiresome, and he wasn't in the mood for further confrontation. The air was thick with the scent of salt and rust. Before him stretched a beach, but it was no pristine shore. It was a wasteland of discarded appliances, broken furniture, and tangled metal. Izuku paused, his eyes scanning the chaos. To most, it would have been an unsightly dump, but to him, it was something else entirely. After his detour brought him to the beach, Izuku scanned the sprawling mess of discarded appliances, rusted machinery, and tangled wires. His analytical mind whirred to life, seeing not a wasteland but a treasure trove of possibilities. He crouched near a heap of broken washing machines, carefully prying open panels and inspecting the internal components. "Corroded. Brittle. Unusable," he muttered, tossing aside a burnt circuit board. But every so often his hand landed on a piece with potential, a gear intact, a motor still functional, or wires that could be salvaged. He worked methodically, pulling anything of interest into his bag. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the sand, Izuku's bag was filled to capacity. Satisfied, he dusted off his hands and began the walk home. Back in his room, Izuku unloaded his findings onto his desk. The pile was an eclectic mix of wires, circuits, and scrap metal. He turned on his desk lamp, its beam highlighting the chaotic assortment as he began sorting through each piece. The initial excitement waned as he examined the items one by one. He flipped over a rusted coil, only for part of it to crumble in his hands. "Most of this is junk," he muttered, frustration creeping into his voice. A quick inspection revealed that much of what he had salvaged was either too damaged or outright useless. Not one to waste time lamenting, Izuku leaned back in his chair, tapping a pencil against his chin. His sharp mind began piecing together solutions. Instead of dwelling on what he couldn't use, he focused on what he could make. But frustration quickly gave way to determination. He grabbed a blank sheet of paper and began sketching furiously. "If I can't rely on the material as is," he murmured, "then I'll make it usable." Two designs began to take shape under his pencil. The first was a material analyzer, a handheld scanner that could quickly distinguish between trash and salvageable components. By measuring density, conductivity, and molecular integrity, it would allow him to sort through the debris with precision. The second was a more ambitious project. A renewable matter converter, a device designed to break down unusable materials and repurpose them as energy or raw components. It was complex, far beyond anything he'd built before, but the potential was too great to ignore. The dim light of Izuku's room illuminated his focused expression, casting long shadows on the cluttered. In front of him lay a nearly completed device. its sleek frame of salvaged metal housing an intricate network of circuits and microprocessors. The material analyzer was taking shape, a tool designed to distinguish between useful components and worthless debris. It wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity for someone working with limited resources. Izuku's hands moved with mechanical precision, a soldering iron in one hand and tweezers in the other. He guided the final connection into place, securing a sensor node onto the analyzer's main board. The faint scent of flux lingered in the air as he sucked off the iron and sat back, scrutinizing the device. The material analyzer was modest in size, no larger than a smartphone, with a screen that displayed data overlays and a scanning lens embedded at its center. Izuku pressed a button, and the device powered on with a soft hum. Lines of code flashed across the screen as it booted, signaling the systems were operational. He reached for a box of spare parts, grabbing a mix of salvaged wires, rusted screws, and cracked capacitors. Holding the analyzer over the assortment, he activated the scanning function. A faint blue light swept across the objects, and information began populating the screen. Conductivity, 32%. Structural integrity, compromised. Material, aluminum alloy, degraded, the device reported in a calm, synthesized voice. Izuku's fingers brushing over the device's casing. Functional. But the algorithm needs refinement. Precision isn't where it needs to be. He made a quick note in his journal, jotting ideas for optimization. It would suffice for now. Izuku didn't waste time. With the analyzer operational, he turned his attention to his most ambitious project yet, the renewable matter converter. Blueprints for the device were spread across his desk, a chaotic web of schematics and equations. The concept was simple in theory but maddeningly complex in execution. Break down waste materials and reconstruct them into usable energy or raw components. Hours turned into days as Izuku worked on the converter. His focus was unyielding, his movements deliberate as he assembled prototypes, tested energy pathways, and recalibrated power outputs. The faint hum of his tools filled the air, blending with the sharp clink of discarded components. Slowly, his workshop descended into organized chaos, blueprints scattered, tools piled haphazardly, and a cold cup of tea left untouched on the workbench. By the fourth prototype, he began to notice a pattern in the failures. Each test ended the same way. Energy loss during the conversion process was too high, and molecular breakdown was inconsistent. The converter could reduce materials to their base components, but it couldn't generate the energy required to sustain the process. "It's not adding up," Izuku muttered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the latest prototype. His green eyes narrowed as he reviewed the data. The numbers didn't lie, every variable seemed accounted for, yet the machine refused to work as intended. He dismantled the prototype and started again, isolating subsystems for individual testing. He replaced faulty components, modified the energy intake design, and adjusted the output stabilizer. Each iteration brought minor improvements, but the core issue persisted. Izuku flexed his fingers, stiff from hours of soldering. His eyes were bloodshot, his posture rigid as he leaned over the workbench. The hum of the converter filled the air, a constant reminder of how close he was, and how far. The 11th iteration flickered to life, its interface lighting up with promising energy readings. Izuku straightened, watching intently as the machine processed a small piece of scrap metal. The hum grew louder, a low vibration that rattled the tools nearby. For a moment, the energy readings stabilized, climbing steadily. Then, without warning, they spiked dangerously high. Izuku slammed the emergency cutoff, the machine powering down with a sharp click. Smoke curled from the input chamber, and he stared at the charred remains of the test material. His expression didn't change, but his pencil tapped against the notebook with measured rhythm. "The problem isn't mechanical," he said quietly. "It's the energy dynamics. I'm missing something fundamental." Izuku's logical mind pushed him toward the next step, research. He needed information beyond his current understanding of physics and engineering. After securing his workshop, he made his way to the city library. The library was vast and quiet, its tall shelves lined with books on every conceivable subject. Izuku moved through the aisles with purpose, scanning titles and pulling anything remotely related to energy systems or material science. By the time he reached the section on theoretical physics, his stack of books had grown precariously tall. One title caught his attention: Foundations of Quantum Mechanics. Its gold lettering faded from years of handling. Izuku flipped through its pages, skimming sections on wave-particle duality, superposition, and energy states. The implications were staggering, reshaping his understanding of energy manipulation. His sharp mind processed the concepts with ruthless efficiency. The gaps in his designs weren't failures of mechanics, they were failures of perspective. Energy wasn't a continuous flow, it existed in discrete states, governed by probabilities and quantum phenomena. "This explains it," he murmured. It wasn't revelation. It was alignment, the clarity of seeing the pieces of a puzzle fall into place. Back in his workshop, Izuku immersed himself in the quantum mechanics text, cross-referencing it with his notes and blueprints. Energy transfer wasn't a simple transaction. It involved quantum tunneling, resonance stabilization, and state transitions. Armed with this knowledge, Izuku began rewriting the blueprint for the renewable matter converter. His pencil moved with precision, sketching designs that accounted for quantum coherence and energy optimization. Equations filled his notebook, each variable calculated down to the smallest decimal. The new design was sleeker and more efficient, integrating quantum stabilizers and state regulators. Izuku's focus was unrelenting, his movements measured as he assembled the components. Days blurred together, but his mind remained sharp, his purpose unshaken. When the final connection was secured, Izuku powered on the prototype. The machine hummed softly, its energy readings stable and consistent. He placed a small piece of rusted metal into the input chamber and initiated the process. The blue light swept across the material, breaking it down with clinical precision. Energy readings climbed steadily, and after a few moments, the process was complete. The output chamber opened, revealing a small, pristine ingot of raw metal. Izuku picked up the ingot and turned it over in his hands, analyzing its texture and composition. "Acceptable," he said simply. He made a note in his journal: parameters optimal. Efficiency, 98.7%. The sun glinted off a sea of twisted metal and shattered glass as Izuku knelt on the gritty sand. His material analyzer hummed softly in his hand, a beacon of calm precision amidst the chaos of the beach. The screen flickered to life, displaying a live readout of the object before him: a rusted, jagged pipe. Material: iron. Integrity: 78%. Processable. Izuku's eyes narrowed in satisfaction. "Solid enough," he murmured to himself, tossing the pipe into the pile marked usable. To his right lay a growing mountain of irredeemable junk, twisted wires, shattered plastics, and composites too degraded even for his renewable matter converter to break down. He'd revisit the pile later with improvements, but for now, he had to prioritize efficiency. The next item was a shattered console screen, its jagged edges glittering under the sun. Izuku adjusted the scanner, narrowing the field for a more precise reading. Material: mixed silicates. Integrity: 21%. Processable. Limited. Energy cost: high. He frowned. Not worth the effort, he decided, gently placing it in the discard heap. The process wasn't just about salvaging materials, it was about refining his judgment, making sure each choice was logical and deliberate. The beach buzzed with quiet purpose, the sound of the renewable matter converter whirring faintly in the background. The machine worked diligently, reducing unusable materials into condensed, energy-rich blocks. It wasn't as fast or efficient as Izuku wanted, but it was a work in progress, much like everything else in his life. Izuku stepped back, surveying the skeletal framework of his workshop with a critical eye. Steel beams scavenged from abandoned debris formed the structure's main support, while bolted panels served as temporary walls. It wasn't perfect, but it was a physical manifestation of his relentless vision. "This will do for now," he muttered, brushing sand off his hands. He glanced up at the sky, noting the sun sinking lower. The fiery orange hues reminded him of how late it was getting. Izuku knew better than to push his luck. His absence wouldn't go unnoticed forever. The moment Izuku entered the house, he heard the familiar, lively chatter of his family echoing from the living room. He paused in the hallway, just out of sight, listening. "So, how was your training today?" His mother's voice was warm, proud. "Awesome," Himari replied, her tone brimming with confidence. "Dad says I'm getting better at controlling my quirk. I even managed to land a solid punch during sparring." Izuku could practically hear All Might's booming laugh. "That's my girl. Keep at it, and you'll surpass me in no time." Izuku's face remained neutral as he continued down the hall, his footsteps quiet on the hardwood floor. He slipped into his room without a word, the door clicking softly shut behind him. His room was cramped but meticulously organized. Blueprints lined the walls, each detailing his inventions in painstaking detail. Notebooks filled with calculations and modifications were stacked neatly on the desk, alongside a small assortment of tools and half-finished gadgets. Sitting down, Izuku pulled out his notes from earlier, flipping to a schematic of the pulse generator upgrade. His pencil hovered over the page, his mind already working through the inefficiencies he'd noticed during the last test. Downstairs, the conversation about Himari's training carried on, the sound growing faint as Izuku lost himself in his work. The next day, Izuku sat in the back of the classroom, his notebook open before him. While the teacher droned on about Newtonian mechanics, Izuku's attention was elsewhere. His pencil moved with quiet precision, sketching the outline of a new gadget. Next to it, calculations filled the margins, detailing energy output, field stabilization parameters, and possible failure points. In his other hand was a quantum mechanics book he'd borrowed from the school library. Each line he read sparked a new idea, which he quickly jotted down. His goal was clear: refine the energy shield prototype to withstand higher levels of stress while maintaining efficiency. "Izuku Yagi." The teacher's sharp voice cut through his thoughts like a WHP. Izuku calmly looked up, his face unreadable. "Yes, sir." The teacher gestured impatiently at the equation on the board. "Solve it." Izuku rose, walking to the front of the class with measured steps. He glanced at the problem, kinetic energy calculations, and solved it in his head. Picking up the chalk, he wrote the answer with deliberate precision. 3,600 joules, he said simply, handing the chalk back. The teacher's frown deepened, clearly annoyed that Izuku hadn't stumbled. "Correct. But maybe you could pay attention for a change." Izuku gave a single nod and returned to his seat. Around him, whispers erupted. "Why does he even bother? It's not like he's going to be a hero," one classmate muttered. Another snickered. "Probably thinks he's some kind of genius." From her seat near the front, Himari turned, smirking. "Don't be too HRD on him," she said mockingly. "He's just practicing for his future. You know, as a garbage collector." Laughter rippled through the room, but Izuku didn't react. His pencil continued moving, his focus unbroken. By the time Izuku returned to the beach, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. His backpack felt heavier than usual, filled with tools and components he'd salvaged from the day's trash bins. He set to work immediately, bolting panels into place and reinforcing the framework of his workshop. The generator hummed softly as he wired it to power his lights and devices, illuminating the space with a steady glow. With the workshop taking shape, Izuku turned his attention to the pulse generator, determined to address its lingering flaws. The last test had shown instability at higher frequencies, and he couldn't afford such weaknesses in the field. He adjusted the modulator, recalibrated the connections, and fine-tuned the power output. As the device powered up, emitting a faint hum, Izuku felt a surge of anticipation. "Let's see how you handle this," he murmured, aiming it at a mound of sand. The pulse rippled outward, scattering the sand in a controlled burst. The movement was smoother than before, the energy more focused. Observation, stability improved. Efficiency increased by 12%. Further adjustments required. Izuku jotted down the results in his notebook, his mind already racing with ideas for the next iteration. Night had fully fallen by the time Izuku left the workshop, his bag slung over his shoulder and his gadgets secured. He walked with purpose, his footsteps echoing through the quiet streets. The neighborhood grew darker and rougher as he ventured deeper, the glow of streetlights giving way to flickering bulbs and looming shadows. He turned a corner and froze. Ahead, a group of thugs loitered near an abandoned building, their voices low and rough. Izuku didn't hesitate, his expression calm as he approached. One of them noticed him, his eyes narrowing. "What do we have here?" Izuku's hand moved to the pulse generator at his side. His movements were deliberate, his face unreadable. "Well, kid," another thug sneered, stepping forward. "You lost or something?" The night sky stretched above Izuku Yagi, veiled in faint clouds that obscured the stars. He walked with an unhurried pace, each step deliberate, his bag secure on his shoulder. The weight inside it wasn't just tools or gadgets, it was potential. Every device had been carefully crafted and upgraded in the crucible of his workshop. Tonight wasn't a simple field test. It was data collection. Validation. As the streets grew darker, the hum of city life faded into distant murmurs. Izuku adjusted his path, steering toward the quieter, more decrepit part of town. The flickering of dying streetlights overhead cast erratic shadows, but Izuku remained calm. He had scouted this area thoroughly, and the alleyway he chose led to a dead end he could control. The faint shuffle of footsteps behind him confirmed it. He glanced over his shoulder just enough to see them, a group of 4 men emerging from the shadows. Their laughter and coarse voices echoed through the narrow street. "Hey kid," one of them called, his tone laced with mockery. "Where do you think you're going?" Izuku didn't respond. Instead, he subtly quickened his pace, leading them deeper into the alley. The thugs followed, their confidence growing with every step. "I'm talking to you, brat," the leader barked, his voice harsher now. The sound of heavy boots grew louder as they closed in. Izuku reached the dead end, stopping a meter from the chain-link fence. He turned slowly, his expression cold and unreadable. He set his bag down with meticulous care, kneeling to unzip it. The leader, a wiry man with a scar running down his cheek, smirked. "Oh, you've got something in there for us, huh? What is it?" "A phone." "Tools, maybe," added the heavy-set thug with tattoos covering his arms. "Probably thinks he's a mechanic or something." Izuku remained silent, his hands moving with practiced precision as he retrieved the pulse generator. The device hummed faintly, its glow casting an eerie light on the alley walls. The leader squinted at the strange gadget. "What the hell is that?" Izuku pressed the trigger without a word. A shockwave burst forth, rippling through the air with a low-frequency thrum. The scar-faced leader stumbled, his balance thrown off as the force hit him squarely. Behind him, his companions winced and staggered, clutching at their heads as the pulse disrupted their equilibrium. Izuku didn't rush forward. Instead, he reached into his pocket and retrieved a notebook, jotting down observations as the thugs recovered. Pulse generator, effective within 6 meters. Disruption of inner ear balance consistent. Delay in secondary recovery noted. Adjust emitter frequency for faster neural disruption. The wiry thug with the blade was the first to recover, his face contorted with rage. He lunged forward, the blade gleaming in the faint light. Izuku calculated the trajectory instantly, diagonal slash aimed at his upper torso. He sidestepped with surgical precision, his hand darting to his grapple line. The cord shot out, wrapping tightly around the thug's wrist. Izuku yanked hard, forcing the man off balance and into the brick wall with a dull crack. The blade clattered to the ground as Izuku tightened the line further, immobilizing his target. Grapple line, tensile strength verified. Note, recoil delay tolerable but could be optimized. He released the cord abruptly, letting the thug collapse to the ground, dazed. Turning his attention to the heavy-set man charging at him, Izuku activated the shockwave gauntlet. A quick twist of his wrist adjusted the output, and he drove his fist forward in a calculated arc. The kinetic burst erupted on contact, sending the man flying backward into a stack of rusted barrels. The metallic clang reverberated through the alley as the barrels toppled, burying the thug in a pile of debris. Izuku paused to observe the results, noting the distance traveled by his opponent and the level of destruction caused. Shockwave gauntlet, range and force output effective. Test against reinforced targets pending. The brass knuckles thug hesitated, his confidence wavering as he watched his comrades fall one by one. His gaze darted between Izuku's impassive face and the glowing devices in his hands. "You think you're tough, huh?" the thug spat, stepping forward. He raised his fists, the knuckles glinting in the dim light. "Let's see how you handle this." Izuku didn't wait for the man to strike. He activated the energy shield, a translucent barrier flickering to life on his forearm. The thug's punch connected with the shield, the impact dispersing harmlessly across its surface. Sparks flew as the brass made contact, but Izuku remained steady. He shifted his stance, using the shield to shove the thug backward before deactivating it. The man stumbled, and Izuku followed up with a calculated kick to his knee, forcing him to the ground. Energy shield, power consumption minimal. Impact resistance satisfactory. The scar-faced leader, now recovered, grabbed a discarded pipe from the ground and swung it wildly. Izuku ducked, the pipe whooshing past his head. With one swift motion, he activated the sonic disruptor, its high-pitched frequency cutting through the air. The leader dropped the pipe, clutching at his ears as the device overloaded his senses. Izuku stepped forward, delivering a precise blow to the man's sternum with the gauntlet. The kinetic force drove him to the ground, gasping for breath. Sonic disruptor, frequency output verified. Adjustment required for prolonged exposure, risk of device overheating noted. Izuku scanned the scene, noting the positions of the fallen thugs. The alley was silent now, save for their groans and the faint hum of his devices. He knelt once more, pen in hand, and began writing down his final observations. General combat notes. Efficiency satisfactory. Energy consumption levels stable across all devices. Areas for improvement identified in grapple line and sonic disruptor. Future tests required to assess long-term device durability. He stood, his calm gaze sweeping over the defeated group. There was no anger, no satisfaction, only a clinical detachment. Izuku reached down, retrieving his bag and securing his gadgets. As he turned to leave, the scar-faced leader managed to croak out a question. What the hell are you?" Izuku glanced over his shoulder, his face expressionless. "Efficient." Without another word, he disappeared into the shadows, leaving the thugs broken and bewildered. Back at his workshop, Izuku carefully disassembled the sonic disruptor, examining its components for signs of stress. The faint glow of his work lamp illuminated the organized chaos of his workspace, blueprints, tools, and spare parts scattered across the table. He made notes for adjustments, already envisioning the next iteration. Each confrontation was a step forward. Each flaw exposed was a lesson learned. Izuku Yagi didn't fight for glory or recognition. He fought for perfection, one device, one calculated action at a time. The soft hum of fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above. The classroom was filled with the sound of idle chatter, papers rustling, and the sharp clack of shoes against tiled floors. Amid it all, Izuku sat at his desk, entirely unfazed by the world around him. His fingers slowly turned the page of the book he was reading, Quantum Mechanisms and Theories of Dimensional Overlap. His eyes scanned each line with sharp precision, his pencil tapping softly against his notebook as he jotted down notes in the margins. "Look at him," one student sneered from across the room. "Does he even understand what's written in that thing?" "He's just pretending," another one laughed, his voice louder than necessary. "Trying to look smart, 'cause he's got no quirk." The snickers spread across the room, cruel and calculated. But Izuku didn't acknowledge them. He was already too focused on his task to give them the reaction they were looking for. His attention remained fixed on the page, turning each with deliberate, measured care. "Pathetic," one of the boys muttered as they turned away, clearly disappointed by Izuku's lack of response. It was all predictable. Every day, the same taunts, the same mockery. But today, something about the book caught his attention. If reality is but a series of frequencies and vibrations, then in theory, one could harmonize those frequencies to create a bridge, a portal, from one point in space to another. Izuku's pencil paused mid-tap. His eyes narrowed just slightly as his brain processed the sentence, moving at the usual clinical pace. For a moment, everything else in the room ceased to exist. His body, still and unmoving, reflected the same mechanical precision that defined his thoughts. Harmonize frequencies to create a bridge. The words processed with a cold, calculating efficiency. There was no emotional response, no rush of excitement. Just an immediate, logical analysis. The idea was intriguing, but its potential had to be evaluated, refined, tested. His pencil resumed its motion, now writing down his thoughts and observations, his mind already running through a sequence of possibilities, each more calculated than the last. But before he could go deeper, the sound of the classroom door sliding open broke his concentration. The teacher had arrived. Izuku's hand moved without hesitation, slipping the book into his bag with precise, methodical motions. His mind remained fixed on the theory, but the situation required no further action. The teacher's presence was a distraction, and Izuku had no intention of engaging with it. "All right, take your seats," the teacher barked, and the classroom settled into an uneasy quiet. Izuku simply adjusted his posture, mentally filing away the new concept for later, where it would be analyzed further in the silence of his workshop. His focus had never wavered. Even now, as the noise of the classroom returned, his mind was already several steps ahead, processing the implications of what he had just read. The day crawled forward, but like all things, it eventually ended. The bell rang, students rushed out, and Izuku remained behind, quietly packing his books. He'd be going to the workshop today, but first, he had one last note to finish copying. The door slid open. 3 figures stepped in. Izuku knew who it was before he even looked up. "Bakugo." "Deku," Bakugo's voice echoed with that sharp, dangerous edge. Izuku glanced toward him, unimpressed. "You're early," he said, stuffing his notebook into his bag. "Just in time. I needed test subjects for some new gadgets." "You think we're your test subjects now," sneered one of Bakugo's lackeys as he stepped forward. "You better watch your mouth, freak." The boy lunged, throwing a wild punch toward Izuku's face. But instead of panicking, Izuku's hand moved with precise calm. A soft beezy followed as a shimmering, hexagonal energy shield formed in front of him, absorbing the punch with a thump. Izuku didn't hesitate. He swept the boy's legs with a low kick, sending him crashing to the ground. The second lackey rushed in, but Izuku raised his hand again. His glove shifted, the red metal panels clicking into place like clockwork. Thrum! A concussive shockwave rippled through the air, sending the second boy flying backward. He slammed into a desk, coughing as he hit the ground. "Learning," Izuku muttered as he shook his hand free from the glove's locking mechanism. "Of course," Bakugo grinned. His palms cracked with sparks as he crouched low. "You think I'm dumb enough to come at you head-on like last time?" Izuku's eyes narrowed. "He's waiting for me to act first." But Bakugo didn't wait. He launched forward, an explosion propelling him toward Izuku. At the last second he changed direction, veering to Izuku's blind spot. Izuku spun, aiming a kick at Bakugo's face, but Bakugo caught it mid-swing. "Gotcha!" Bakugo hissed before a flash of orange light detonated in Izuku's face. The blast sent Izuku flying back into the wall. Dust and debris fell from the ceiling, and the room went quiet. "Not bad," Izuku coughed as he stood, brushing off the dust. The door suddenly slid open. Their teacher walked in, eyes sharp as ever. "What's going on in here?" he barked. "It was Yagi," Bakugo said quickly, pointing. "He started it." "Yagi?" The teacher raised an eyebrow. "You mean Izuku Yagi?" His eyes scanned the room. "Where is he?" Bakugo spun around, eyes wild. "What?" His gaze darted to every corner of the room. "He was right here." The teacher scowled. "Stop wasting my time. Clean this mess up." He grabbed some papers from his desk and left without another word. Bakugo's jaw tightened, eyes narrowing. Slowly, his gaze dropped to the floor. Dust was scattered everywhere, except for a small, faint footprint leading toward the door. Outside the school gates, Izuku's silhouette flickered into view like a mirage resolving itself into reality. The faint hum of energy faded as he removed a sleek, matte gray helmet from his head. He ran his fingers along the smooth surface, eyes flicking to a small dent near the ear. "Still needs work," he muttered to himself as he stuffed it into his bag. Back at his workshop, Izuku sat motionless at his desk, a faint light from the overhead lamp casting sharp shadows across his face. His fingers absent-mindedly traced the edges of the book before him, his mind completely absorbed in its contents. It had taken him hours to read, to analyze each word and concept. Yet, despite the depth of the information, it wasn't enough. The theories presented were insightful but incomplete. They were nothing more than fragments of a puzzle he had already begun to piece together, but a crucial piece was still missing. Izuku needed more data, more clarity, more precision. He needed to understand the mechanics fully before he could take any meaningful steps forward. He closed the book, leaning back in his chair, the creak of the leather echoing in the silence of the room. He didn't waste time with idle thoughts or hesitation. This was a problem that required resolution, not deliberation. His eyes flickered over the workshop, scanning the various gadgets and blueprints scattered about, but he knew the answer wouldn't lie there. The information he sought was beyond the confines of this place. With a single, decisive movement, he stood and grabbed the book, slipping it into the bag at his side. There was only one place where the knowledge he needed could be found: the city library. The familiar scent of old paper and dust filled his senses as he stepped through the front doors of the city library. The soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the faint rustling of pages made the space feel timeless. This was one of the few places where Izuku felt at peace. The librarian glanced up from her desk as he approached. "Back again, huh?" she said, her voice laced with mild amusement. Izuku gave her a small nod, quietly handing her the book he'd borrowed last week. Her eyes briefly scanned the title. "Quantum mechanisms? Still on the science binge, I see." He didn't respond, heading straight for the science section. He moved with purpose, eyes scanning the spines of books with precision. Quantum fields. Wave resonance. Harmonic vibrations. His gaze locked onto one title: Wave-particle duality and spatial overlap. He pulled it from the shelf, running his fingers over the cover before tucking it under his arm. He continued searching, adding a few more books to his growing stack. Once satisfied, he carried them to the front desk. The librarian raised an eyebrow at the sheer number of books. "Interesting choice of books, must say," she muttered with a grin as she scanned them. "You know, I've never seen a kid like you before. Most kids your age are outside playing with friends or something. You, though, always reading. I want to borrow all of these," he said with a neutral tone, ignoring her comment. "Quite stingy, aren't ya?" she replied, shaking her head but scanning the books anyway. Once she was done, she handed them back to him. "Try not to break your back carrying all that, genius." Izuku gave her a small nod and walked out, arms full of knowledge. Back at his workshop, Izuku unpacked his books and notes onto his desk. He sat down, picked up wave-particle duality and spatial overlap, and flipped to the introduction. His pencil was ready, his notepad open beside him. Hours passed. The room grew colder as the sun dipped below the horizon, but Izuku didn't notice. Pages turned, notes were scribbled, and sketches filled the corners of his notebook. Every so often he'd mutter something like, "That's it," or "Not quite," as he connected one concept to another. At some point, he glanced at the clock and saw that it was already midnight. His body ached from being in one position for too long. Stretching his arms, he felt a small pop in his back. Time to head home, he thought. He packed his notes into his bag, making sure every sheet of paper was accounted for before locking up the workshop. The house was dim, save for the soft glow of the kitchen light. Izuku quietly stepped inside, placing his bag on the floor. On the counter, a plate of food was waiting for him, kept warm beneath a lid. It was rice, miso soup, and some fried fish. He stared at it for a moment, his gaze distant. Slowly, he lifted the lid and sat down. As he ate, his mind wandered back to Dr. Kuroda's book. "If reality is just frequencies." The phrase echoed in his mind. Each repetition revealed new possibilities, each more ambitious than the last. His hand moved on its own, picking up rice with his chopsticks, but he wasn't truly present. He was still in his workshop, in his mind, drawing diagrams on the wall, calculating frequencies, and testing theories. After finishing his meal, he quietly placed the dishes in the sink and headed upstairs. His bedroom was modest. A simple bed, a desk, and a corkboard with more notes pinned to it. He sat at his desk and pulled out his newest acquisition, Resonance Theory, a deeper look. He read until the glow of dawn crept through his window. Several weeks later, the scene at his workshop had changed dramatically. Pages of notes were no longer scattered randomly, they were organized in a system only Izuku could understand. Each page was pinned to the wall in a meticulous sequence. Equations connected with red string formed a web of logic. The messy chaos of earlier weeks had evolved into something greater. Izuku stood in the center of it all, a pencil tucked behind his ear, his eyes scanning the entire layout like a general surveying a battlefield. His notebook lay on the table beside a new set of sketches. There was the frame, the containment field, the emitters, and the power source. Each piece had been theorized, calculated, and improved. No longer random thoughts. No longer ideas. This was something else entirely. A blueprint. He stepped back, arms crossed. The weight of everything, weeks of sleepless nights, relentless research, and failed concepts, finally settled on his shoulders. But it didn't feel heavy. He glanced at the notebook one last time, a grin tugging at the corner of his lips. "No more reading," he muttered. His gaze shifted to his tools and raw materials, his eyes sharp with resolve. Time to build. The workshop buzzed faintly with the rhythmic hum of Izuku's tools as he stood before the skeletal frame of his latest experiment, the portal. This was the third iteration, each more refined than the last. His hands moved with surgical precision, securing each component with mathematical exactness, as his eyes, sharp, calculating, assessed every piece of the puzzle that was slowly taking form. The workshop was a blend of organized chaos, with blueprints pinned to the walls and diagrams of frequency harmonization and spatial resonance theories covering every available surface. There was no room for distraction here. Each failure, each adjustment, was a necessary step toward the perfect design. Piece by piece, the portal took shape. Every bolt was tightened to perfection, every wire connected with a precision only Izuku could achieve. The process was methodical, mechanical, and devoid of hesitation. Hours bled into each other unnoticed as the device gradually neared completion. When the final bolt was secured, Izuku stepped back and surveyed the structure. It was a towering frame, lined with harmonic emitters and a gleaming containment field generator. His sharp gaze lingered for a moment, inspecting the mechanics. There was no pride in his observation, only cold calculation. Turning to the control panel, he tapped a few buttons, feeding power into the portal's systems. A faint hum echoed through the workshop as the first surge of energy passed through. But nothing happened. Izuku's fingers hovered over the controls, his mind already anticipating the failure. The emitters flickered weakly, barely responding to the influx of energy. Then, without warning, a surge of sparks erupted from the base of the portal. Metal twisted with a violent crack, followed by the acrid smell of burnt components. The explosion sent debris flying, but Izuku's movements were precise, instinctive, his energy shield flaring to life around him just in time to deflect the worst of the blast. When the chaos subsided, the workshop fell into a heavy silence. Izuku deactivated his shield, calmly approaching the wreckage of the portal. His gaze was detached, methodical, as he crouched down and examined the twisted components. Picking up a fragment of metal, he scrutinized the edges, noting the areas of stress and damage. "Insufficient stabilization," he murmured to himself, the words cold and clinical. "Frequency misalignment in the secondary emitters." Straightening, Izuku's eyes scanned the workshop. The remains of the portal were scattered across the floor, but there was no hint of frustration. He merely gathered the debris, feeding it into the renewable matter device that hummed softly in the corner of the room. The machine absorbed the material, breaking it down and reconstructing it into usable resources. In minutes, the pieces were restored, deposited into a neat tray beside the device. Izuku wasted no time. He immediately returned to his workbench, jotting down notes as his mind moved forward, calculating the next steps. Rework the frequency calibration, he muttered, already shifting his focus. His pen moved quickly, adjusting equations and refining his designs. With no sense of time passing, he continued working. By noon, the portal's design had been reworked, the flaws identified, and the next course of action clear in his mind. Without acknowledging the clock or the fact that his body was beginning to feel the weight of exhaustion, Izuku packed his notes and left the workshop. The day's work had concluded, but it was only a small step in his greater goal. The next day, Izuku bypassed school entirely. His mind had already moved past the need for social interactions. School was a necessary inconvenience. He would attend just enough classes to avoid suspicion, and the rest of his time was spent within the confines of his workshop, relentlessly refining the portal. His body never acknowledged the passage of time. No hunger, no thirst, no fatigue, only the pursuit of perfection mattered. Izuku spent countless hours refining his portal project. His understanding of quantum mechanics, spatial resonance, and harmonic frequencies expanded with each failure. When a test failed, he didn't react with frustration. Instead, he dissected the error, made adjustments, and moved forward with even more precision. Each misstep was data, a valuable lesson in the pursuit of perfection. He had no need for validation. His results, no matter how small, were enough. Results were the only truth. And the portal was his singular truth. Every time the portal fizzled out or destabilized, Izuku meticulously rebuilt it, reworking the emitter frequencies, recalculating energy output, and adjusting the containment field. He explored new materials, experimented with different power sources, and even constructed new tools to measure energy fluctuations with unparalleled accuracy. His knowledge grew exponentially, as did his obsession with creating the perfect portal. As the months passed, the outside world began to fade even further into the background. He had long stopped keeping track of the calendar, and family events felt like meaningless interruptions in his quest. He didn't need to be acknowledged, nor did he care. It wasn't that he hated his family, they simply did not matter in the equation of his goals. His interactions with them had become automatic, mechanical. He existed beside them, but never within the same world. It was during one of these long stretches of isolation that his routine was disrupted. A rare family gathering, an event that seemed inconsequential in the grand scheme of his work. Izuku was on his way to the workshop, the steady rhythm of his footsteps marking the start of another day filled with experimentation. The sun had barely risen, and the cool morning air hung around him as he made his way across the beach. His thoughts were already absorbed in the calculations for his next portal iteration. Suddenly, his mother's voice called from behind him, pulling him from his thoughts. "Izuku, it's your sister's birthday today. Could you help out?" she asked, her tone casual and almost distant, as if it were an afterthought. Her words felt as hollow as the smiles that accompanied them. Izuku didn't react immediately. Her voice seemed distant, muffled, as if it belonged to a world he had long since left behind. He paused for a brief moment, processing the request with mechanical precision before responding. "Of course," he replied, his voice steady and neutral. It wasn't that he wanted to be involved. It was simply another task to be performed with the same precision he applied to his work. A necessary part of the routine. The preparation for the birthday party unfolded before him, but it was all mechanical, hanging decorations, arranging gifts, and setting the table. He had no emotional connection to the event. To him, the task was no different from calculating the next step in his portal project, except it was wrapped in the superficial layers of family celebration. His hands moved methodically, but his mind remained fixed on the equations he would refine once the charade was over. Once he had fulfilled his obligations, he retreated to his workshop. The laughter and voices of his family faded into the background as he shut the door behind him. By evening, Izuku returned to the workshop. The portal's latest iteration was nearing completion. He fit the final piece into place, his movements deliberate, every component aligned with meticulous precision. Hours passed, and the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the workshop. The hum of the machines filled the silence as Izuku finalized the last adjustments. When the final step was complete, he activated the portal. At first, nothing happened. The silence in the workshop was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the containment field generator. Izuku's eyes remained fixed on the device, his mind already calculating potential errors. But before he could make another adjustment, the portal flickered to life. A faint glow began to emanate from the frame, and the hum grew louder. The vortex materialized within the ring, its edges shimmering with energy. Izuku narrowed his eyes, studying the phenomenon with the detachment of a scientist observing a test subject. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the vortex collapsed, and the portal powered down with a low, sorrowful whine. Insufficient power output, Izuku noted aloud, already jotting down observations in his notebook. His mind processed the failure without hesitation. There was no sense of frustration, only curiosity about the root cause. A minor energy imbalance. Easily rectified. Late that night, Izuku stood outside a nearby power plant, the cool air sharp against his skin. He had calculated the exact energy requirements for the portal, and it was clear that the power plant's output would suffice. With precision, he tapped into the plant's grid, creating a makeshift conduit to feed the necessary power into his workshop. The process was meticulous, requiring him to mask the surge in energy to avoid tripping alarms. The lights flickered briefly, a faint ripple in the city's electrical grid, but Izuku adjusted the flow with swift, calculated movements. Returning to the workshop, he connected the portal to the plant's grid. The city's lights flickered before plunging into darkness. Inside the workshop, the portal roared to life. The vortex stabilized, its edges glowing steadily with an otherworldly light. Izuku observed it for several moments, confirming its stability. Satisfied, he disconnected the conduit, ensuring no evidence remained. By the time the city's power returned to normal, Izuku had already dismantled his setup, leaving only the fully functional portal as a silent witness to his work. The portal shimmered, its edges crackling with volatile energy that rippled like liquid light. Izuku stood motionless before it, his fingers grazing the smooth, cold surface of the device. His mind calculated anticipation warred with a gnawing uncertainty. The steady hum of the portal vibrated through the room, a constant reminder of the leap he was poised to take. This wasn't a mere step forward. It was a dive into the unknown, a decision that could irrevocably alter the fabric of his existence. Izuku tightened his grip on the controls, his breath steady but shallow. He replayed the countless scenarios he had envisioned, his mind racing to account for every variable. Yet, no amount of preparation could erase the simple truth: the unknown lay ahead, vast and indifferent. With a final, resolute breath, Izuku stepped forward. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, he was swallowed by an abyss of nothingness. It struck him all at once: the oppressive silence, the absence of gravity, the sterile void that eated away every familiar sensation. As the void enveloped him, Izuku's mind remained methodical. The absence of gravity, sound, and atmosphere registered as data points to be catalogued, not causes for alarm. His chest tightened, signaling the lack of oxygen, lungs burning as his instincts screamed for oxygen. The void was merciless, an unforgiving realm that allowed no room for hesitation. Retreat. Izuku's arm shot out, his fingers clawing for the portal's edge. The surface felt both solid and fluid, like cool mercury beneath his touch. His body drifted farther into the expanse, the pull of inertia working against him. Summoning every ounce of control, he grasped the edge and propelled himself backward. The instant his body passed through, the familiar embrace of gravity seized him. He staggered, inhaling deeply as air rushed back into his lungs, its sweetness a stark contrast to the sterile nothingness he had just escaped. Izuku collapsed to one knee, his mind already dissecting the experience. His thoughts raced to identify the flaws in his approach, the vulnerabilities that had left him exposed. The void was not a hindrance, it was an anomaly to be analyzed and overcome, its variables demanding resolution. The workshop buzzed with activity, a symphony of clicks, hums, and the occasional spark. Izuku stood at the center of the chaos, his green eyes narrowed in focused determination. The smell of metal and oil filled the air, mingling with the faint tang of burnt circuits. Around him, an array of tools and components lay scattered across the workbench, a meticulously organized chaos that mirrored the calculations running through his mind. Every movement was deliberate, each step of the process mapped out with precision. The framework of the suit began to take shape under his skilled hands. He started with the foundation, layers of insulating fabric designed to regulate temperature and withstand extreme conditions. Next came the airtight seals, each one meticulously tested to ensure absolute integrity. The suit had to be perfect. Failure was not an option. As the hours wore on, Izuku's focus never wavered. He moved with a mechanical efficiency, his hands assembling the specialized components required for survival in the void. Radiation shielding, oxygen recycling systems, enhanced durability, all painstakingly integrated into the suit's sleek design. Every piece was a testament to his ingenuity and determination. By the time the final piece clicked into place, the workshop was littered with discarded tools and scraps of material. Izuku stepped back, surveying his work with a critical eye. The suit stood before him, a masterpiece of engineering and survival. Its dark, streamlined exterior was both functional and imposing, the internal systems humming softly as he powered it on. Izuku adjusted the helmet, feeling the snug fit as it sealed around his head. The suit's systems came alive, the gentle hiss of oxygen cycling through its filters a reassuring sound. He flexed his gloved fingers, testing the range of motion. Satisfied, he turned his attention back to the portal, its shimmering surface beckoning him once more. This time he was ready. Izuku stepped through the portal again, the edges of the vortex collapsing behind him in a brief shimmer of energy. His boots clicked against an unfamiliar surface as he emerged into the unknown. The suit's internal systems hummed faintly, regulating his oxygen supply and analyzing the atmosphere. The room he entered was vast, its metallic walls reflecting faint lines of pulsating light. These veins of energy ran in precise patterns across the surface, lending the space an alien, otherworldly feel. The air was sterile, unnaturally so, and the silence was overwhelming, broken only by the faint hum of unseen machinery. Izuku's green visor highlighted the details of the space as his mind processed them. Every observation was catalogued, every irregularity noted. His gloved hand brushed against the smooth, cold wall. Material composition unknown. Energy transfer patterns. Consistent, he muttered, his voice filtered through the comms in his helmet. He advanced methodically, his boots leaving faint impressions on the pristine floor. The corridors stretched out in unnerving symmetry, their geometry so perfect it bordered on unnatural. Along the way, his visor marked sections of damage, scorch marks and stress fractures in an otherwise flawless structure. Localized damage. Evidence of external stress. Impact minimal on internal systems, he noted. After several minutes of walking through the eerily precise corridors, Izuku reached a set of massive double doors. They parted with a soft hiss, revealing a vast control room beyond. He stepped inside, immediately struck by the scale of the space. Consoles lined the walls, their surfaces covered in alien symbols and faintly glowing panels. Screens flickered weakly, casting intermittent light across the room. The hum of dormant machinery filled the air, its presence more felt than heard. It didn't take long for him to notice something off about the room. The cold, metallic surfaces, the perfectly symmetrical layout, everything screamed of a level of technology far beyond what he had ever encountered. But it wasn't until he reached a large, curved panel embedded in one of the walls that the full scope of his situation hit him. Through the transparent surface of the panel, he saw it, the vast, infinite expanse of space. Stars glittered like distant diamonds against the endless black, their cold light flickering across the surface of a massive, desolate landscape. Slowly, Izuku's gaze shifted, his visor scanning the stars, calculating, comparing. His mind quickly pieced the puzzle together. He wasn't on some unknown planet as he'd initially assumed. He was in space, aboard some sort of colossal vessel, drifting among the stars. Izuku took a step back, his eyes still locked on the view outside. The room around him suddenly felt less like an isolated chamber and more like a small part of something much, much larger. The enormity of it all didn't affect him emotionally, but it sharpened his focus. The sense of place had shifted from unknown terrain to the realization that he was aboard a ship, alone, adrift in the vastness of space. Turning away from the window, his visor automatically adjusted to scan the rest of the room. In the center stood a massive pillar, its surface engraved with intricate patterns that pulsed faintly with light. The pillar stretched from floor to ceiling, and surrounding it were dormant panels, integrated into the ship's systems. The room was a control hub of sorts, or at least it had been. Izuku approached the pillar, his visor processing data at a rapid pace. The material was unlike anything he had ever encountered, and the energy readings fluctuated wildly, hinting at a technology far more advanced than anything from his world. It was clear that the pillar was central to the functioning of the ship, or whatever this place had been. Central system. Function unknown. Purpose. Critical, he muttered, scanning the structure, calculating its significance. He stepped closer, his boots making faint echoes on the sterile floor. His visor analyzed the intricate patterns etched into the surface of the pillar, noting their shifting nature. The patterns seemed to react to his presence, subtly changing, almost as if the pillar itself were aware of him. Izuku's gloved hand hovered over a nearby panel, his fingers barely grazing its surface. When his fingers made contact, the pillar responded. A soft hum resonated through the room, and the symbols on its surface flared to life. They flowed like liquid fire, the patterns twisting and shifting with a purpose, lighting up in a cascade of brilliant hues. The air in the room vibrated as if the very atmosphere was reacting to the pillar's awakening. A deep rumble, like the groan of a slumbering titan, reverberated through the control room. But before the pillar could fully activate, a strange sensation washed over Izuku. His visor flickered, its sensors adjusting to an unseen force as the pillar's surface rippled. There was a moment of tension, a brief silence as the energy in the room seemed to hold its breath. The pillar, sensing an alien presence, initiated a scan. Izuku felt a strange pressure in his mind, a quiet hum of unfamiliar data being processed. It was as if the pillar was examining him, analyzing his neural patterns, his physical presence. Then, the hum intensified, and Izuku's visor shifted, displaying a series of symbols that shifted in rapid sequence, too fast for him to comprehend. "It's adapting to me," he realized immediately, his thoughts racing. The pillar was altering its communication protocol. The strange symbols on its surface began to change, now reforming into something more familiar, shapes, words, and phrases he could understand. His visor flickered again, and the alien language was replaced by a string of intelligible characters in his native tongue. The translation was seamless, the language adapting perfectly to his understanding. Then, from the heart of the pillar, a hologram began to take shape. It was humanoid, yet distinctly alien, with sharp, angular features that flickered and warped in the dim light. The hologram's voice was calm but carried a heavy sorrow, its words resonating with an almost palpable weight. "Welcome, traveler," it began, its tone calm but steeped in sorrow. Or, "Watcher, as you may be called. If you are seeing this message, then you have found the custodian of knowledge. The last of our kind to remain here. The last, perhaps, to witness what we once were." Izuku's visor flickered slightly as he processed the words, cataloging the information with dispassionate precision. The being before him was addressing him directly, "Watcher." He knew this was no accident, but an inevitability. The message was for him. The hologram's voice shifted, darker now, carrying the weight of ancient regret. "We were once 𝐀𝐮𝐿 of the universe, beings of unimaginable power. A Type 7 civilization, capable of reshaping reality itself. We created life, transcended death, and controlled the forces of time and space. But our power, our ambition, led us to destruction." Izuku's mind began to piece things together, silently processing the tragedy before him. The hologram paused for a moment, as if gathering the strength to continue. "We were not the only ones in this galaxy. There were those more powerful civilizations beyond us. Type we believed we could defy the natural order, that we could control everything. But we were wrong." The figure's form flickered again, the instability of the projection growing more pronounced. Its voice was tinged with bitterness, as though recounting a painful truth. The war began with internal conflict, a struggle for demps. It spiraled beyond control, drawing the attention of civilizations far beyond our reach. And when they came, we were helpless. We fought with everything we had, but our greatest weapon turned out to be our own undoing. We tore apart time, we erased stars, and we played at being gods. But we were nothing more than fragile beings, standing before forces we could not comprehend. The hologram's account unfolded, a litany of hubris and destruction. Izuku processed the data with clinical efficiency, cataloging their errors as a warning rather than a tragedy. The hologram's voice grew even quieter, almost a whisper, as if speaking from the edge of oblivion. The war destroyed everything. Our home planet, reduced to ash. All our colonies, eradicated. Every living being of our species, wiped out. We were forced to flee as our world collapsed. Ships overloaded with survivors, fighting for the last remaining resources. Some died trying to escape the war-torn planet. Others perished in the chaos of the Exodus. The few of us who are left now are the last to carry the legacy of what we were, the only ones who managed to flee, those who were fortunate enough to be here. Izuku's gloved hand brushed the wall as he processed this. Their escape was not a moment of triumph, but a desperate, frenzied flight for survival. The ship, their final refuge, was never meant to be a sanctuary. It was simply the last place where the remnants of a destroyed civilization had clung to life. "We are the survivors of a lost war," the hologram intoned, "but there is no victory in survival. We escaped, but we have no home to return to. No civilization to rebuild. All that remains is this ship, adrift in the vast emptiness, carrying the last of us." Izuku's eyes narrowed as the hologram's form flickered once more, struggling to stay intact. "This ship is a tomb. We had hoped to preserve our knowledge, to ensure that at least something of our legacy would survive. But now, there is nothing left but regret. The last of our species will die here, aboard this ship, lost in the void." The figure faltered, as if gathering its last breath. "The knowledge, all that we were, all that we discovered, it is yours now. We leave it to you, Watcher. Take it. Use it. But know this, we were the emissaries of our own destruction. We believed ourselves above the laws of the universe, and we paid the price. Do not follow in our footsteps. If you do, you will face the same end." Izuku stood still. He had absorbed the entire history of their downfall, their hubris, the war, the destruction of their planet, and the last remnants of their species trapped aboard this ship. The compartment in the pillars slid open with a soft hiss, and a disk emerged, glowing faintly in the dim light of the control room. Izuku's hand moved, reaching for it, his fingers closing around the relic without hesitation. The acquisition of knowledge was the only outcome of value. The disk pulsed faintly in his hand, a repository of potential, awaiting analysis and application. The remnants of a once great civilization now belonged to him. The portal's shimmering energy dissipated behind Izuku as he stepped into the stillness of his workshop. The soft hum of the machines greeted him, but it felt distant, as though the world itself was holding its breath. His movements were fluid, almost mechanical, as he unlocked the helmet of his makeshift spacesuit. The faint hiss of depressurization broke the silence, and the helmet came off, revealing a sheen of sweat on his focused face. He placed the helmet gently on the workbench, the smooth surface catching the soft light from above. Piece by piece, the suit came off, the components falling to the floor with a muted clatter, their purpose fulfilled. The cool air of the workshop contrasted sharply with the suffocating atmosphere of the void he had just left behind, but his mind was already moving past it. He gathered the discarded parts into a neat pile and tossed them into the renewable matter device. A soft hum and a flicker of light signaled the suit's assimilation, its materials broken down for future use. Izuku's gaze drifted to the small, glowing disk in his hand. He could feel its pulse, the energy of the artifact still vibrating faintly, almost like it was waiting for something. A mission. A purpose. His thumb brushed the surface, and the faint glow reflected off his glasses, casting a soft light across his face. He glanced at the clock on the wall. 3:12 a.m. A tired exhale escaped his lips, but his focus never faltered. Fatigue had little place in a mind always calculating, always analyzing. The task ahead of him was clear. This disk had to be understood. Analyzed. Slowly, carefully, with precision. His hand moved with practiced efficiency, securing the disk inside a compartment in his bag before slinging it over his shoulder. He paused for a moment, taking one last look around the room. It was a familiar sight: the cluttered workbench, the scattered tools, the piles of materials half-finished. The world around him always felt in motion, like there was something to fix, something to improve. But for now, everything was at rest. The streets outside were quiet, the cool night air against his skin as he walked home. His boots echoed softly, a rhythmic sound that mirrored the calm in his chest. The world outside seemed distant, muted. His mind was already working through the possibilities, processing the new data, wondering what this discovery would lead to. But there was no urgency. A task to be done. By the time he reached his house, it felt like the silence had followed him. The front door creaked open, and he stepped inside, greeted by the messy living room. Streamers clung to the ceiling, and discarded cups and plates were scattered across every surface. A sugary smell lingered in the air, remnants of Himari's party. Upstairs, Izuku's room was as he left it, quiet, still, untouched. He set his bag down on the desk with a soft thud, feeling the weight of the disk inside. But even that was a distant thought. His mind was already elsewhere. With a quiet exhale, Izuku turned toward the bed. His body sank into the mattress, the familiar creak of the springs barely registering. The chaos of the day, of the discoveries, the risks, the alien technology, fell away as his breathing steadied. His mind had done enough for the day. The rest could wait. In seconds, he was asleep, the world around him growing quiet as his body finally let go. The faint light of morning filtered through Izuku's blinds, gradually pulling him from sleep. His emerald eyes blinked open, sharp and focused despite the fatigue that still clung to his body. Without a moment's hesitation, he swung his legs off the bed and stood, his movements deliberate as he made his way to the bathroom. The cool tiles of the bathroom greeted him as he stepped inside. He ran water over his hands, feeling the sting of cold against his skin, before adjusting the shower's temperature. The warm spray of water soon followed, washing away the residue of yesterday's effort. The shower, though brief, was a necessary routine. Clean, composed, prepared. Dressed in his usual attire, black hoodie and dark jeans, Izuku left the bathroom with a quiet purpose. His footsteps were soft on the floorboards as he walked down the hall, each stride measured and efficient. He passed the staircase, a fleeting glance toward the empty kitchen confirming what he already knew. The house was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator. The plates from last night's party remained stacked haphazardly on the counter, evidence of the noisy gathering he had scarcely attended. Izuku noted the indentation on the dining table, where an envelope had likely rested. A shopping list or itinerary. His family had left early, no doubt for Himari's errands. They always did, prioritizing her over everything else. Izuku didn't need a note to understand. Opening the fridge, he surveyed the sparse contents. A few leftover containers, shoved carelessly aside. The absence of any fresh food told him everything he needed to know. There was nothing for him here. Izuku selected a sandwich and a half-empty bottle of water and ate in silence, the simple act of nourishment barely registering in his mind. Once finished, he discarded the packaging, washed his hands, and left the house. The door clicked softly behind him. His destination. The workshop. The door to the workshop slid shut with a faint hiss, and the low hum of machinery filled the air, a familiar sound, one that signaled the start of another task. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of overhead lights, casting long shadows across the cluttered workbench. Tools, components, and half-finished projects lay scattered, but today, there was only one focus: the disk. Izuku placed the small, glowing disk on the workbench, its surface pulsing gently with a faint light. It was an unassuming object, but its significance was boundless. It was the culmination of a journey that had started when he first stepped through the portal into the remnants of the Type 7 civilization. The knowledge contained within it wasn't just advanced, it was unimaginable. This was not the kind of technology that could be measured by conventional standards. It was a glimpse into a reality where physics and the natural laws had been bent and restructured. Izuku's fingers grazed the surface of the disc, and the moment his hand made contact with the disc, the room around him shifted imperceptibly. A low hum vibrated through the air, and the very atmosphere seemed to ripple. A soft glow began to spread outward, casting an ethereal light that filled the space. The disc responded to his presence, and before him, 7 spheres materialized in the air. They hovered in perfect alignment, each one glowing with a different hue, pulsing rhythmically, their energies both alien and familiar. Each sphere represented a level of knowledge from the civilizations across the cosmos, a journey through space and time, knowledge waiting to be unlocked. The first sphere, a muted gray, caught his attention immediately. It felt as if it was calling to him, not with words, but with an undeniable, silent pull. Izuku didn't hesitate. His fingers brushed against its surface, and the moment he activated it, the sphere expanded rapidly, unfolding like a flower in full bloom. The hologram before him transformed into a dynamic 3D lattice of energy, equations, systems, and abstract concepts, each part rearranging itself into an intricate, evolving structure. The other 6 spheres remained suspended in the background, their presence barely noticeable as the gray sphere took center stage. It pulsed softly, its glow steadily intensifying as it began to reveal the vast store of knowledge of Type 0 civilization. As Izuku focused, the hologram did not remain static. It shifted, interacted, and adapted, revealing systems of incredible complexity, energy conversions, quantum flows, and the fundamental building blocks of the universe, all accessible with a simple movement of his hand. For Izuku, the core concepts of Type 0 civilization were familiar. Thermodynamics, energy flow, atomic interactions, these were foundational subjects he had already explored through his own work. Yet what was once a trivial subject now unfolded with an unexpected depth. This wasn't just information, it was a sensory experience, a multidimensional map of reality itself. He zoomed in with a swipe of his fingers, and the hologram responded, magnifying the scene before him. Atoms collided, releasing energy in real time, their paths visible as they ricocheted off one another. Electrons moved in calculated orbits around atomic nuclei. The movement of particles, the transfer of energy, everything was laid bare before him. This wasn't just theory, this was the very fabric of the universe unfolding in front of him, layer by layer. With every touch, new dimensions of understanding opened. He watched as the molecules in the system reacted with near-perfect precision. Each atomic collision was captured in exquisite detail, and he could see the subtle shifts in energy as each molecule vibrated and interacted. It was an interconnected web, everything working in perfect harmony, and the complexity of it all, though immense, did not overwhelm him. In fact, it felt intuitive, like a puzzle whose pieces were falling into place the moment he looked at them. Izuku's fingers danced across the air, manipulating the hologram as he honed in on specific areas of interest. The display shifted, showing a complex energy converter, an efficient system for capturing and transforming energy without loss. As the hologram unfolded, the layers of the converter expanded, revealing how it captured temporal energy fields and used them to stabilize power flow. Izuku's mind raced as he watched the system in action. He had already tinkered with energy conversion, but this was an entirely new approach, a method of energy harnessing that eliminated inefficiencies. He reached deeper into the design, tracing the interactions of quantum particles with a focused eye. The hologram revealed how energy could be captured, stored, and redistributed without the usual losses inherent in most systems. Each component of the energy converter was intricately designed. Every piece worked in perfect synchrony. Izuku could even see the quantum interactions that allowed the device to exist in a state of perpetual equilibrium. It was a marvel of engineering, and yet it was only the beginning. But Izuku wasn't content just observing. As the design revealed itself, his mind immediately began to process and iterate. This system wasn't just a model, it was a starting point, a base for improvements. He could see ways to make it more efficient, more compact. In a matter of moments, his fingers were already manipulating the design. The hologram bent to his will, shifting and rearranging as he made adjustments. He isolated parts of the system, refining the energy pathways, recalibrating the temporal stabilizers. Stabilizing energy flow, he muttered under his breath, as he mentally noted the changes. He scribbled down ideas in his notebook: optimize energy transfer using nanomaterial conductors, use superconductive coils for zero-loss energy conduction, minimize the heat dissipation with advanced quantum coatings. Yet even as he explored, a deeper sense of possibility stirred within him. This converter, while extraordinary, was still a static solution to a dynamic problem. What fascinated him more was what lay beneath the surface of the hologram: how energy could be manipulated on a quantum scale, how space-time itself could be bent to make energy flow in more efficient patterns. As if responding to his thoughts, the hologram shifted once again. This time, it displayed something even more ambitious: a model of space-time manipulation and the creation of portals. Izuku had built his own rudimentary portals before, crude by comparison, but this was something else entirely. The system displayed a refined version of his own concept, with energy fields bending and warping, allowing passage between different points in space. But this was no simple doorway. It was a sophisticated system, one that harnessed the fundamental properties of the universe to create stable and reliable portals. The intricate schematics unfolded before him, revealing the complex processes that made this possible. Izuku's mind absorbed the details with lightning speed. The portal's energy flow was stabilized using precise quantum field manipulations, directing energy into a singularity that bent space and time. The hologram displayed how dimensional calibrations were continuously adjusted, how energy was redistributed to prevent collapse. Every interaction, every minute detail, was laid out before him in perfect clarity. This was beyond what he had imagined. This wasn't just about creating portals. It was about 𝐾𝐮𝐻 space-time itself. Izuku zoomed in on specific areas of the design, watching the flow of energy as it rippled through the system. The complexity was staggering. He saw how the system adjusted the portal's entry and exit points in real time, how the energy needed to stabilize the passage was modulated by quantum particles. This wasn't just a way of opening doors, it was an entire infrastructure, an interdimensional transport network that connected the far reaches of space and time. He traced the paths where energy converged, studying the intricate mathematical equations that governed these interactions. Izuku's mind spun with possibilities. This technology wasn't just about creating portals for travel. It could be used to establish connections across vast distances, to build an infrastructure that spanned galaxies. It could be used to transport materials, people, and knowledge between planets, across systems, across universes. The idea of portals becoming the foundation for a universal network was exhilarating. He focused on a set of equations detailing quantum entanglement and dimensional resonance. These were concepts he had only barely touched upon before. But as he zoomed in, the equations adapted to his understanding. They clicked into place. Izuku scribbled in his notebook with a focus that could only come from complete mastery: quantum entanglement for multi-point travel, dimensional resonance for portal stability, optimizing energy pathways for interdimensional use. He didn't flinch in the face of this overwhelming knowledge. This wasn't a barrier, it was a challenge. A puzzle waiting to be solved. And for Izuku, challenges were not obstacles. They were opportunities to build, create, and innovate. The portal system continued to evolve before him, its design expanding in scope. But Izuku knew that he had reached a point where he could take the next step. The knowledge he had gained was vast, but it was also practical. It was a foundation he could build on, refine, and perfect. With a final swipe, he dismissed the hologram, letting the model fade into the ether. His mind was already shifting focus, already anticipating the next sphere, the Type 1 civilization. Mastery over planetary systems awaited, and Izuku was ready. Time skipped 2 years. The vastness of space stretched endlessly, an inky void punctuated by distant stars, swirling galaxies, and nebulae that glowed with faint, ethereal light. The cold silence of the cosmos was broken only by the faint hum of unseen forces, the constant, imperceptible dance of gravity, the ebb and flow of interstellar energy, and the slow, inexorable drift of forgotten relics lost to the passage of time. In this seemingly empty expanse, the remnants of ancient civilizations floated in disarray, their once great creations now mere shadows of their former selves, scattered across the void. Amidst the debris of these long-lost worlds, a ship hovered in the depths of space, its sleek surface scarred by time and the wear of 1,000 years. Once a majestic vessel, a symbol of advanced engineering and technological prowess, it now stood still, waiting in silence. It was a ship beyond the capabilities of its creators, a vessel whose secrets had long been forgotten, its story lost in the annals of history. Alone and abandoned, it had drifted through the ages, untouched and undisturbed. The ship had been here for longer than anyone could remember. Time had stretched far beyond the limits of human comprehension. But now, something had changed. The ship was no longer a passive observer in the vast emptiness. It was awakening. The soft, almost imperceptible hum of nanobots filled the space around the vessel, their activity invisible to the naked eye. These microscopic workers moved in unison, tirelessly repairing, rebuilding, and refining the ship with an efficiency far beyond any human creation. The dark matter collected by the lone figure who stood in the center of the ship's hull had been transformed into a catalyst for the ship's restoration. The nanobots, now powered by this energy, worked with precision, guided by a blueprint that was ever evolving as they brought the ship closer to its intended form. Inside the ship, the work neared completion. Izuku's gloved hands moved with practiced precision as he carefully inserted the final nanotech component into the ship's intricate control system. Each movement was deliberate, honed through countless hours of study and practice. The ship's surface shimmered slightly as the nanobots automatically affixed themselves, sealing the component into place. The intricate web of repairs was now complete. Izuku stepped back, observing the vessel before him. The ship's dormant systems hummed to life, their awakening a slow and deliberate process. The long slumber was over. Lights flickered on throughout the hull, casting long, shifting shadows across the expansive interior. The ship was vastly larger now, 10 times its original size, a stunning fusion of sleek, advanced design and highly functional engineering. The scale of the transformation was breathtaking, and yet, Izuku's gaze remained fixed, unblinking, taking in the complex systems and infrastructure that now filled the ship's interior. With a final check of the oxygen levels and the ship's atmosphere, Izuku removed his spacesuit. The cooling system hissed softly as it powered down, and the suit's internal systems began to shut off. The air inside the ship was crisp and clean, just as he had anticipated. It was breathable, devoid of the sterile, artificial smell that filled most space vessels. He moved past the ship's newly upgraded control center, the hum of the internal systems guiding his steps, the pulse of the ship's rejuvenated power source resonating throughout the space. The ship was now fully operational. Izuku moved toward the lab, a vast room filled with the clutter of unfinished projects, some of them still in various stages of development, others already complete but yet to reach their full potential. It was a place where raw ideas were given form, where concepts were born and then shaped into reality. And yet, in this environment, perfection had not yet been achieved. There was always more to do, more to understand. Among the various inventions scattered across the lab stood 2 of Izuku's most ambitious creations, completed months earlier, but still foundational to the progress he had made. The first was the zero-point energy generator, a compact but incredibly powerful device capable of harnessing the limitless energy of the vacuum of space. The core of the generator hummed softly, vibrating with the immense energy it drew from the emptiness around it. By tapping directly into the zero-point field, the quantum energy that exists even in the deepest vacuum, it produced virtually limitless power, drawing no fuel from the outside world. Beside the energy generator stood the zero-point fabricator, dormant and waiting for activation. Equally powerful, The fabricator was capable of creating both matter and energy from nothing by manipulating quantum fluctuations. With it, raw energy could be converted into solid matter at will. Simple tools, complex structures, and even entire systems could be created instantaneously. Izuku had developed both of these devices months ago, at a time when his understanding of Type 7 technology was still in its early stages. He had unlocked the critical knowledge that allowed him to build these creations, but he had not yet fully mastered the intricacies of the advanced technology. The knowledge was there, but the application required much more time and study. He was still learning, refining his understanding and discovering new aspects of the technology with each experiment. It was through this ongoing process of trial and error that he was able to use the near-infinite energy produced by the zero-point energy generator to power the nanobots that restructured the ship. This energy fueled the nanobots' efforts, allowing them to perform complex repairs and upgrades. The generator's power enabled the ship's growth, its transformation from a once-abandoned vessel to something far greater. The ship had expanded tenfold in size, and as it did, its internal systems grew more sophisticated, adapting to the increasing scale of the vessel. Amid the scattered experiments and devices filling the lab, Izuku's gaze settled on a small pedestal near the far wall. Resting on it was a test tube filled with a dark, liquid-like substance that appeared almost alive. The black fluid swirled slowly, faint ripples spreading across its surface as though reacting to his presence. Tiny, almost imperceptible flecks of light shimmered within the liquid, resembling stars suspended in a miniature cosmos. This was one of his most daring creations, the biomorphs. Izuku approached the pedestal. The test tube was contained within a translucent shell of reinforced alloy, designed to isolate and protect its volatile contents. With a swift swipe of his hand, he deactivated the field, allowing the pedestal's interface to open. The faint hum of the containment system faded as he retrieved the test tube and held it up to examine its contents. The biomorphs represented a turning point in his research. They were the culmination of his studies into Type 5 technology, a blend of dark matter, energy, and nanotechnology. These nanobots, or biomorphs, were designed to integrate seamlessly with organic life, enhancing and evolving it in ways that traditional augmentation could never achieve. Izuku had first discovered references to such constructs in the archives of a Type 5 civilization. Their capabilities were described in tantalizing fragments, yet as those civilizations advanced to Type 6 and beyond, the biomorphs were conspicuously absent. Whether they were abandoned or deemed obsolete remained unclear, but their potential had drawn his attention. They stopped working on it, even with its potential, Izuku murmured. He placed the test tube on a nearby workstation, his tone neutral. They couldn't have reached its full capabilities. The biomorphs he had created were far beyond the original designs. Powered by the zero-point energy generator and fabricator, he had refined their structure at the molecular level. These new biomorphs weren't merely tools, they were symbiotic, capable of merging with organic life to enhance its physiology on an unprecedented scale. They could restructure cells, rewrite DNA, and adapt their host's body to any environment, all while drawing energy from the boundless reserves of dark matter itself. Izuku prepared the injector with precision, his focus unwavering. For months, he had studied the biomorphs in isolation, simulating their integration into organic systems, analyzing their behavior under countless conditions. But now, it was time to move beyond theory. True understanding required direct experience. He rolled up his sleeve and applied the injector to his forearm. There was no hesitation. His actions were deliberate and measured. He had accounted for every variable. With a sharp hiss, the biomorphs surged into his veins. The effect was immediate. A cold, electrifying sensation spread from the injection site, coursing through his body like a tidal wave. Muscles tensed, vision blurred, and a searing heat ignited deep within his core. Pain followed, a sharp, all-encompassing ache as the biomorphs began their work. Izuku staggered, gripping the edge of the workstation as his body underwent its transformation. His cells burned with energy, his bones ached as though being reforged, and his DNA unraveled and rewove itself in a process that was both agonizing and methodical. He fell to his knees, gasping for breath as his vision flickered. His veins pulsed with an eerie black glow, the biomorph's presence visible beneath his skin. Yet, even through the pain, a growing sense of power emerged, a hum that resonated through his being. Minutes passed before the pain began to subside. Izuku steadied himself, the faint hum of the biomorphs reverberating through his body. The sensation was immediate and intense, something foreign yet undeniably present. He closed his eyes for a moment, focusing inward. His senses were the first to register the transformation. His olfactory perception was the first to sharpen. He inhaled deeply, and the world around him flooded with a myriad of scents, chemicals from the lab, the faint musk of the room's air, the trace of sweat on his own skin. Every scent was crisp, defined, and overwhelming in its clarity. The minute details of his environment became as apparent as though they were in front of his eyes. He opened his eyes, and the change in his vision was almost blinding in its clarity. He could see every detail of the room with perfect precision, even the smallest dust particles hanging in the air. The room's light seemed brighter, sharper, and every shadow was cut cleanly. He could see the veins running through his hands, the faintest movements in the farthest corners of the room. His hearing shifted next. The room, which had been silent before, was now alive with noise, distant mechanical whirring, the rhythmic beat of his own pulse, the soft hum of the ventilation system, even the faintest movements outside the room. Every sound was distinct, every vibration clear. Senses, acute. Olfactory, auditory, and visual perception heightened. Tactile sensitivity elevated beyond baseline, Izuku murmured, his voice flat and precise, his mind cataloging the new information without a hint of surprise. He opened his eyes fully, returning his attention to the physical test. Now, his enhanced senses pushed aside, he turned his focus inward, evaluating his muscles and strength. He raised his hands, examining them with a cold, methodical focus. His fingers flexed as he tested the fine motor control, smooth and effortless. Every movement felt precise, deliberate. He moved his arms, rolling his shoulders and twisting his torso, carefully evaluating each joint. There was no resistance, no stiffness, only fluidity. He crouched low and then sprung upward. His legs propelled him with startling force, lifting him several feet into the air. He landed with perfect balance, every muscle engaged and responsive. The power he felt was beyond anything his previous body had known. Joint integrity, stable. Muscle responsiveness, heightened. Reflexes, instantaneous, he noted, observing his own movements with clinical detachment. He approached a reinforced metal panel mounted on the wall, a remnant of an old experiment. With deliberate focus, he curled his fingers into a fist. He struck the panel with calculated force. The impact was immediate. There was a sharp, resounding clang as the metal buckled inward, cracks radiating outward. Izuku stared at his hand. The panel, designed to withstand extreme pressure, had crumpled as though it were paper. Strength, significantly enhanced. Impact force, at least 5 times baseline, possibly more, he concluded, his voice steady and analytical. He flexed his fist slowly, examining the results. There was no discomfort, no strain, just the raw power of his new form. Turning to a nearby workstation, Izuku activated a diagnostic system. The holographic interface flared to life, presenting a full suite of tests: agility, speed, endurance, precision, and cognitive capacity. He selected the full suite of assessments, ready to measure every facet of his transformation. "Let's determine the full extent of these capabilities," he stated, his thoughts driven purely by the need for data. For as long as I could remember, Izuku had been nothing. He existed in the background, a shadow in the corners of our house. Honestly, I couldn't even recall a time when he'd been anything more than that, silent, distant, practically invisible. It was almost as if he wasn't even trying. It made me wonder, though, if he even wanted to be noticed, or if he just accepted that he'd always be overshadowed by people who mattered. He was weak, quirkless, a relic of the past in a society where strength and power ruled everything. The idea of a hero without a quirk was laughable, and Izuku fit that mold perfectly. There was always this emptiness about him, like he didn't belong anywhere. He was there but never really there, if you know what I mean. It was like he was this faint, annoying presence, something you couldn't quite get rid of, but you also didn't want to acknowledge. He was a non-entity, a side note, a footnote in the book of life. Me on the other hand, I was different. I mattered. I always had. My power wasn't just a gift, it was a legacy. Light manipulation, something only a few could dream of. My parents made it clear from the start that I was going to be their pride, their success. They'd brag about me to anyone who'd listen, always pushing me to do more, be more. I was going to surpass their expectations, the world's expectations, and become something no one could ever ignore. There was pressure, sure, but it wasn't a burden, it was a privilege. I was meant for greatness. I was their shining star. Izuku. He was just irrelevant. He didn't even deserve a place in the picture. No one cared about him, and honestly, I wasn't sure why anyone ever had. What had he ever done to deserve anyone's attention? He was a ghost, a presence without substance. I was the one who got all the praise, all the admiration. I was the one who mattered. I didn't even think he cared, and that's what annoyed me most. He never looked at me with anything but that stupid, vacant stare, like he couldn't even be bothered. It was like he didn't even want to be seen. But then again, maybe that's why no one cared. He didn't care. Not about the attention I got, the praise, the love. He didn't want any of it. It was like he had his own little world where he didn't need any of that validation. It was infuriating, honestly. I'd kill to have the kind of indifference he had, but there was no way I could ever just not care like he did. He had all the space in the world to do whatever he wanted without a single expectation on him. And me. I had to carry the weight of everything. My family's expectations, the pressure to succeed. All eyes were on me, and there was Izuku fading into the background. I couldn't even look at him without feeling some kind of disgust. How could someone live in the same world as everyone else and just not care? How could you be so indifferent? It wasn't even like he was trying to be different. It was like he had no longing to be anything. He didn't want to be part of anyone's life, especially not mine. But then, everything changed. I remember my entire body throbbing with pain, each breath feeling like shards of glass scraping through my chest. It's hard to say now if the haze that clouded my vision was smoke or the dizziness seeping in, but everything around me felt. Colors, reds, blacks, and grays, bled together, swirling and twisting in ways that didn't make sense. They melted, mixing in the air like forgotten paint left out in the rain, impossible to separate. The air was thick, heavy. It stung my lungs, thick with something acrid, like BLD and smoke, choking me, suffocating me with each breath. I could hear screams in the distance, but they sounded muffled, distorted, like they didn't belong to this world. Or maybe they belonged to a world I couldn't. And through it all, that laugh. That man's laugh. It sliced through the fog, deep and cruel, the kind of laughter that came from someone who already knew they'd won. It grated on my mind, echoing around me, dragging me deeper into the madness. I tried to move, to do something, anything, but my body wouldn't respond. It felt like it was made of stone, my arms and legs heavy, dragged down by invisible weights. My light manipulation had failed me, leaving me empty, helpless. My vision blurred, the edges of reality fraying and slipping away, my eyelids heavy with exhaustion. I fought to stay awake, but it felt like trying to hold onto something slippery, something that didn't exist. The darkness crept in, swallowing the world around me. Then there was a shadow. A figure. I tried to focus, but my mind was swimming, too foggy to make sense of it. Someone was walking toward us, moving slowly, almost leisurely, as if none of this chaos even mattered. It didn't make sense, but I knew who it was. Izuku. I whispered, my voice cracked and barely audible, lost in the fog of my own mind. It was him. A jolt of panic shot through me, but it was distant, like I could feel it but couldn't act on it. My heart sped up, but it felt like it was happening far away. What was he doing here? Why is he here? Wait. I managed to force the words out, but they felt weak, so weak. They didn't even sound like mine, and I wasn't sure if he heard them or if he even could. Then the darkness pulled me in, and I was lost to it. When I woke up, everything was gone. The light above me was blinding, an unnatural brightness that felt like someone had turned the sun itself toward me. I squinted, my eyes fighting to adjust, but it didn't matter. Nothing felt right. The pain, that gnawing, constant pain, was gone, replaced by a strange, unsettling numbness. My body felt alien, as if I no longer had any control over it. It wasn't mine. The ground beneath me wasn't solid. It shifted with every subtle movement. The air around me was thick, suffocating, the wrong kind of wrong. It was as though reality itself had forgotten its rules. I could make out the faint silhouette of Izuku a few feet away, his figure still, almost distant. Above him, strange drones floated, their dark metallic bodies pulsing with an eerie, steady light. They drifted in slow, deliberate arcs, casting long, twisting shadows that seemed to stretch and warp, as if they were stretching the fabric of time itself. The whole scene felt like a dream, too surreal to grasp, too bizarre to be real. What? My voice cracked, barely escaping my throat, a foreign sound that felt disconnected from me. It was hoarse, weak, almost as if I was hearing it from far away. My own thoughts seemed to slip through my fingers, too heavy to hold onto. Izuku didn't turn. He didn't acknowledge me at all, but the stillness in his posture, the calm, unfaltering way he stood, it was wrong. Too calm. As if he didn't feel the weight of the situation. As if nothing could touch him. And then I saw him. That man. Charging toward us, a massive blur of raw power and rage. His body was a storm, moving too fast for my mind to process. His face, twisted with a dark, almost animalistic snarl, was something I couldn't quite place. Frustration, anger. His fist was pulled back, coiled and ready to strike, to shatter. Izuku, look out. The words ripped out of my throat, a raw scream of desperation. But even as I shouted, it felt like my voice wasn't real, like it was floating away from me, out of reach. Did Izuku even hear me? But he was already on us, his fist flying toward Izuku with terrifying speed. It was impossible to follow, too fast, too brutal. The force behind it rattled the air, distorting everything around it, like the world was bending under its power. The wind howled in its wake, sharp and stinging, as if the punch could tear everything apart. But then, it stopped. It just stopped. The world seemed to freeze in that moment. His fist hung suspended in the air, frozen inches from Izuku's face, as though an invisible wall had materialized out of nowhere. I watched in disbelief as the space between them seemed to warp, twisting like water disturbed by an unseen force. The very air shuddered, shimmering as if reality itself had buckled under the strain. The villain's fist trembled, frozen in place, like it couldn't move any farther, as though something far stronger than him was keeping it locked in the air. His face twisted, eyes narrowed, confusion clouding the rage that had been there moments ago. His muscles bulged, his body straining against the invisible resistance, but he couldn't break through. With a snarl, he tried again. His fist came forward with even more force, the air around it crackling with power. It was almost too fast to see, but once again, just before it could make contact, it stopped. The punch was arrested mid-swing, held back by the same invisible force. It hovered inches from Izuku's face, and the world seemed to hold its breath in that moment. Frozen, suspended, caught in the impossible. The man gritted his teeth, a growl rumbling from deep in his chest. He swung again, this time with more desperation, more fury. Each punch was faster, more violent, the force of it shaking the ground beneath us. The air around him screamed with the effort, but each blow was stopped before it could even land. His fist slammed against the invisible wall again, and each time, the force of it felt like the very earth might crack open. But nothing connected. None of his punches reached Izuku. It was as if the very air itself was rejecting him, refusing to let his attacks touch their target. The punches grew more frantic, more savage, but no matter how much strength the villain poured into them, no matter how fast his fists flew, the invisible wall held firm. It was futile. All of his fury, his violence, his power, Nothing could break through. The villain was locked out. I watched, rooted to the spot, my mind spinning as I tried to process what I was seeing. It felt wrong, all of it. The fight, the power, the invisible force, it was all slipping through my fingers, like I was trying to grasp smoke. A cold wave of disbelief washed over me, seeping into every part of me, pulling me further into confusion. I couldn't understand it. I couldn't make sense of any of it. What was happening? It had been an ordinary day at school, so ordinary, in fact, that it seemed as if time itself had conspired to pass by unnoticed. The lessons unfolded with their usual predictability, the hum of the classroom barely registering in Himari's mind as her teachers spoke their praises, words she had heard 1,000 times before. A smile, a nod, a reassuring pat on the back for a job well done. It was all part of the rhythm. She was accustomed to it, like the sound of the bell marking the end of each PRD or the way the air in the hallways always seemed to carry a faint scent of chalk dust and coffee. When the final bell rang, it was as though the world picked up its pace around her. The school emptied out in a rush of students, backpacks slung over shoulders, chatter filling the air. Himari, however, moved with a calm ease, as if she were somehow separate from it all. Her school bag rested lazily over her shoulder, and with each step, her thoughts drifted toward the small things, the kind of thoughts that usually didn't require any effort. She navigated through the crowds outside the school without really seeing them, her eyes lost in the rhythm of the familiar streets. The usual hum of the city surrounded her, cars honking, distant conversations, the occasional ring of a bicycle bell. Yet something felt. As she walked, the feeling crept up on her, subtle at first. There was a stillness in the air, a quiet that seemed out of place. The streets, usually bustling with the after-school rush, now seemed unnervingly empty. She found herself walking at a slower pace, her steps echoing on the pavement in a way that made the world around her feel muffled. There was no chatter, no clatter of distant voices, no honking of impatient drivers. The distant sound of helicopter blades sliced through the silence like a knife, the rhythmic thrum growing louder with each passing second. At first, it was only a slight disturbance, just another noise in the background of a busy city, but it quickly became undeniable. Helicopters weren't a regular presence in this part of town, especially not at this hour. Himari's senses sharpened. Her mind, which had been wandering through the monotony of the day, snapped to attention. She couldn't pinpoint the direction at first, but the sound of the blades was unmistakable, drawing closer, louder. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. Something wasn't right. She quickened her pace, scanning the sky for the source, her thoughts racing. The sound seemed to be coming from above and beyond, somewhere not far from where she stood. Then she saw them. A pair of helicopters, their dark silhouettes cutting through the overcast sky, flying in tight formation. The familiar hum of the engines vibrated in her chest as they headed in a specific direction, low and fast, cutting across the city with alarming urgency. Her eyes tracked them as they passed overhead. She could feel her heart quickening, an uneasy tension settling in her chest. They weren't just passing through, they were headed somewhere nearby. Without thinking, her legs carried her forward. She started walking faster, keeping her eyes on the helicopters, determined to follow. The distance wasn't far, she could make it if she hurried. As she moved, the sound of blades grew fainter, but the sense of unease in her gut only intensified. Something was happening and she had to know what. She turned the corner, moving deeper into the city, when the thick, acrid scent of smoke hit her like a punch to the face. It was immediate, overwhelming. Her breath caught, and she paused, momentarily disoriented. The smell was unmistakable, burning. Something was on fire and it was close. Instinctively, she pressed forward, quickening her pace once more, determined to get closer to whatever the helicopters were responding to. Her stomach twisted as she approached the source of the smoke. The city, which moments ago had felt so normal, now seemed foreign, almost unreal. And then she rounded another corner, and everything changed. Shattered windows lay scattered across the street like jagged, dangerous confetti, glinting under the dim, flickering streetlights. The once pristine pavement was now littered with debris, torn pieces of metal, brick chunks, and the remnants of vehicles crushed beyond recognition. The air was thick with smoke, a hazy, choking fog that clung to everything, coating the remnants of the city like a shroud. The flames from the wreckage licked hungrily at the sky, casting a grotesque, flickering glow across the scene, distorting the shadows into something monstrous. The street, which should have been bustling with the usual after-school energy, was now a battlefield, unrecognizable, warped beyond belief. The faintest sound of crackling flames and distant sirens were the only things that filled the silence, except for the occasional groan of a collapsing building or a distant crash of debris falling from the remnants of the shattered city. And among the wreckage, the water hose heroes lay motionless. Himari's breath caught in her throat as her eyes fell upon their fallen forms. The heroes who had always been larger-than-life figures to her, beacons of strength and safety, were now broken, twisted bodies, strewn across the destruction they'd once fought to protect. Splash was the first one she saw. Her vibrant blue suit was torn to shreds, stained dark red in places, her body twisted at an odd angle. brilliance pooled around her, mingling with the dirt and ash that had begun to coat the ground. Himari's heart skipped a beat, and her stomach turned. Her gaze darted to Jetstream, his once pristine suit now battered, torn, and stained with brilliance. He was crumpled in the wreckage, his limbs splayed in unnatural positions, his chest barely rising with the effort of each ragged breath. His usually confident and unshakable demeanor was now gone, replaced by the vulnerability of a hero who had fought to the very end. The sight of them, once symbols of hope and power, now reduced to this grim reality, shattered Himari's mind. Her hands trembled as she took a step forward, but it felt as though the ground beneath her was made of stone. What happened? Who did this? The questions echoed in her mind, but there were no answers, only the horrific sight of their fallen forms. And then, as if the nightmare could not become any worse, the source of the devastation revealed itself. From the heart of the destruction, a figure emerged, a hulking mass of violence and power. The villain was a monstrous presence, his massive frame towering over the wreckage like a dark cloud blocking out the sun. His wild, bloodshot eyes gleamed with a twisted sort of satisfaction, taking in the destruction he had wrought. His grin was wide, too wide, as if he reveled in the suffering, savoring the chaos in a way that made Himari's skin crawl. His clothes hung in tatters, barely clinging to his battered form, and his fists were slick with brilliance, likely the remnants of his previous victims. He was a beast of a man, radiating an oppressive, destructive energy that made the very air feel charged, as though an unseen storm was about to break. Himari's legs felt like lead, her instincts screaming at her to run, to flee as far and as fast as she could. But her body refused to move. Her feet felt glued to the ground, her heart hammering in her chest. She couldn't tear her eyes away from him. The villain was the source of all this destruction. The man who had torn the city apart, leaving nothing but carnage in his wake. The villain's eyes locked onto her. For a brief moment, the entire world seemed to freeze. The weight of his gaze pinned her in place, suffocating all else. Himari's breath caught in her throat, her pulse thundering in her ears like a war drum. His smile, sharp and dangerous, stretched wider, more predatory. He moved slowly, deliberately, as though savoring every second. Each step he took toward her felt like the ground itself was trembling under his presence, like the earth was bowing to the overwhelming force of his power. Well, what do we have here? His voice was low, rasping with malice, a growl that seemed to resonate in her very bones. He took another step, and the air around them seemed to grow thick, suffocating. A little light in the middle of all this darkness. How quaint. Himari's stomach twisted with a sickening sense of dread. But even as fear coursed through her veins, she held her ground, her back straight and her chin lifted in defiance. She couldn't back down. Not now. What have you done? Her voice came out steady, though a tremor ran beneath the surface. It was as much a question to herself as it was to him. She could already guess the devastation around them, the broken city, the ruined heroes. It was all his doing. The villain chuckled, the sound a low rumble that seemed to crawl under her skin. What have I done? Open your eyes, kid, he mocked, throwing his arms wide, gesturing to the destruction around them. The answer's right in front of you. Himari's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't flinch. She reached deep within herself, digging into the core of her strength. The familiar spark of energy lit up her palms, the first flickers of light swirling into existence. She held it tight, forcing it into a barrier that materialized in front of her, its radiance casting an eerie glow in the smoke-filled air. The villain's grin widened, amusement dancing in his eyes. "You think this little trick will stop me?" he taunted. His massive fist clenched, muscles rippling beneath his skin like a storm in an instant. He lunged forward with terrifying speed. It was like a predator closing in on its prey, the distance between them vanishing in the blink of an eye. His arm whipped down with such force that the air itself seemed to bend around the blow. The sheer impact of the punch was like a thunderclap. Himari barely had time to react as the shockwave from his attack slammed into her shield. The force rattled her bones, sending a reverberation through her entire body, and the world spun as though she were caught in the center of a storm. The light from her barrier flickered under the pressure, wavering as if it might shatter any second. "I won't let you," she gasped, her voice strained but resolute. She pressed her hands together, attempting to call on more power. The light around her flickered as the villain raised his fist again, his shadow falling over her like a looming storm cloud. Suddenly, a voice, a familiar, urgent voice, cut through the air. "Run!" It was weak but full of desperation. Himari's heart skipped in her chest as her eyes snapped toward the source. Splash's face was ghostly pale, her breaths ragged and shallow, every inhale a struggle as if each breath could be her last. Blood trickled from the corners of her mouth, staining her lips red, but the fire in her gaze remained unwavering. Her body trembled, clearly struggling to stay awake, and her eyes locked with Himari's. "Run!" she rasped, her voice barely more than a whisper, but heavy with the weight of warning. Himari's breath caught. Her heroes, her mentors, her friends, were telling her to run. The weight of their words pressed heavily on her heart. But she couldn't. Not like this. "No," she shouted, her voice trembling with raw emotion. "I'm not leaving you." Without another thought, she surged forward, the light in her hands flaring brighter than before. She wouldn't run. Not now. Not when they needed her. She unleashed a barrage of light beams, each one a sharp, radiant arrow cutting through the air. The beams sped toward the villain with laser precision. Some struck him, causing him to stagger back, but his smirk never wavered. He barely seemed to register the pain, as if her attacks were little more than an annoying itch to him. "Not bad," he said, voice thick with mockery, barely even breathing. "But not good enough." The villain didn't waste a moment. Before Himari could gather her strength for another strike, he lunged forward, his fists moving with frightening speed. She barely managed to raise a second shield in time, the light flaring around her in an attempt to block the devastating blow. The impact was enough to crack her barrier, sending vibrations through her entire body. She felt the shock travel all the way to her bones, nearly making her drop to the ground. But before she could regain her balance, the villain was already on her again. His fists came like thunder, each one faster and more powerful than the last. She tried to block, tried to retaliate, but each attempt only seemed to make him more relentless. He was toying with her. The pain was unbearable. Every blow knocked the breath out of her. Her body screamed, her strength fading, the light in her hands flickering with each impact. She was running out of time. Then came the final strike, a massive, devastating punch that landed directly on her ribs. The force sent her crashing to the ground, the wind knocked out of her. She could barely move, her vision blurry, the edges of her world darkening. "I can't. Give up." Her mind screamed, but her body refused to cooperate. She barely managed to raise her trembling hand, the last of her energy gathering in a thin, fading beam of light. She tried to aim it at the villain, but the light sputtered and dimmed before it even left her palm. His laugh was cruel and booming, echoing through the broken city. "Done already?" His voice oozed with disdain as he loomed over her, his massive form casting a long, menacing shadow over her battered body. "You were fun for a minute, but you're just another dead hero now. Himari grit her teeth, her body screaming for her to stop, but she wouldn't. Not yet. Not yet. Her voice was barely a whisper as she forced herself to her knees, gathering the last of her strength. Her hands trembled, but the light that burst forth was still there, fragile, thin, but shining with everything she had left. The villain sneered, unimpressed, swatting the faint flicker of light aside as though it were a pesky fly. His laugh, low, cruel, victorious, rang out, the sound cutting through the suffocating air like a blade. Her body betrayed her, the weight of exhaustion bearing down on her like a collapsing building. Her arms gave out beneath her, and she crumpled to the ground, her vision swimming in and out of focus. The world around her twisted and blurred, colors bleeding together into a chaotic swirl of reds, blacks, and grays. The acrid stench of BLD and smoke filled her lungs, choking her with each shallow breath. Her entire body felt heavy, unresponsive, and every attempt to move was like trying to swim through quicksand. The villain's laugh continued, deep and mocking, but it sounded farther away now, like it belonged to a different world. Himari tried to focus, to hold on, but the darkness pressed in from all sides, dragging her deeper and deeper into its clutches. And then, through the haze, she saw it. A shadow. Someone was there. Her heart lurched painfully in her chest as she struggled to make sense of the figure moving toward her through the thick smoke. Each step they took seemed deliberate, purposeful, cutting through the chaos with an unsettling calm, as though the destruction around them was nothing more than a distant echo. Izuku. The name slipped from her lips in a cracked whisper, barely audible, swallowed by the heavy air. She wanted to scream, to warn him, to beg him to turn around and run, but her throat closed tight. Her voice wouldn't rise above a broken breath. Panic clawed at her, and her mind began to fray, her thoughts unraveling one by one as the world around her seemed to tilt. The last thing she saw before the edges of darkness began to consume her was the figure stepping forward, standing unwavering in the middle of the wreckage. And then, everything went black. Izuku's gaze remained unfocused as the teacher's voice became background noise, indistinguishable from the hum of the classroom. The lesson, trivial and irrelevant, held no sway over him. He didn't need to pay attention to the details. His mind was elsewhere, immersed in the streams of data that flickered before him, data that held real value, real meaning. Everything else was just noise. His attention shifted to the streams of information surrounding him. 4 holographic windows were suspended in front of him, each displaying different aspects of the world he was observing. The first window showed live traffic data. Every vehicle, every piece of machinery moving outside the school was tracked with precision. The data captured their speed, trajectory, and even minor fluctuations in their movement. The cars and buses, weaving through the streets, were just static markers in a pattern that Izuku had long since come to understand. He didn't need to focus on this. It was nothing more than a predictable flow, an insignificant part of the world. The second window displayed multiple news feeds running in sync, live broadcasts from various local stations. A building fire that had already been contained, a robbery thwarted by a low-ranking hero, some petty political drama. Nothing that held any real weight. These events were commonplace. The same events recycled in an endless loop, their patterns already ingrained in his mind. He flicked his eyes away. Unimportant. The third window tracked local power grids. Izuku's gaze flickered over the data, scanning for fluctuations in energy levels, potential overloads, any irregularities in the system. Small dips and spikes were registered, but nothing out of the ordinary. The city's infrastructure hummed along, as it always did. There was nothing here that required attention. The fourth window monitored public infrastructure, traffic lights, sewage systems, emergency services. Alerts flashed up for minor issues, like a stalled train or a malfunctioning stoplight, but these things were insignificant. The systems were fragile, easily overcome by anyone with even a basic understanding of technology. These alerts would resolve themselves soon enough. But then, something shifted. A subtle change in the flow of data. A spike in energy levels, a sudden fluctuation that broke the predictable pattern. It was almost imperceptible at first. A slight anomaly, barely noticeable, but it stood out. It was a disturbance. Izuku's eyes narrowed, and with a thought, he expanded his focus. Another window appeared before him, a live feed materializing. It showed the source of the disturbance. A battle. Two water-based heroes, Jetstream and Splash, fought against a massive, muscular villain. The heroes fired powerful jets of water and generated thick clouds of vapor, but the villain, an imposing figure, seemed almost unaffected. His quirk, based on muscle augmentation, gave him an immense advantage. Each water blast that hit him was absorbed by his body, dissipating harmlessly into the air. The villain's counterattacks were brutal, each strike sending shockwaves through the ground. His movements were fast, fluid. He was far stronger, faster, and more durable than the heroes he was facing. Izuku's mind flicked to the data. He didn't need to wait for the details to be confirmed. The system had already begun running the analysis. In milliseconds, a new window appeared, pulling up a profile of the two heroes. Jetstream, his quirk allowed him to manipulate high-pressure jets of water. Effective for crowd control and disabling enemies, but not against someone with the raw power this villain possessed. The analysis detailed the hero's physical stats, his water pressure capabilities, and how they compared to 𝐀𝐮𝐿's sheer strength. Ineffective. The second hero, Splash, could generate dense clouds of water vapor, obscuring vision. The system analyzed her quirk in seconds. She could use the clouds to disorient enemies, block vision, and confuse them, but against 𝐀𝐮, it was useless. His enhanced sensory abilities allowed him to navigate through the mist without losing his sense of direction. Izuku's eyes didn't leave the screen as the system compiled the data. He had already opened another window, this one connected to the city's central villain database. He accessed the most up-to-date information on the villain causing the disturbance. The screen flickered for a fraction of a second before presenting the details. 𝐀𝐮𝐿. The database had already processed and retrieved his profile, pulling in information from all previous encounters with heroes. Izuku observed the name and the accompanying data with a detached interest. There was no surprise, no curiosity, only raw analysis. 𝐀𝐮's quirk was listed as muscle augmentation. The data explained that his quirk provided an extreme boost to his physical capabilities. Strength, speed, and durability, each of these were enhanced beyond the capacity of a normal human being. His muscle density had been increased to such a degree that his body could absorb and withstand impacts that would reduce most people to pulp. The quirk didn't just make him stronger, it made him a force of nature, a living wall of physical prowess that couldn't be overcome by traditional means. Izuku scrolled through a list of past encounters, his eyes flicking over the profiles with disinterest. Hero after hero had faced off against 𝐀𝐮𝐿, and every time, the result was the same, defeat. Each profile provided detailed data, hero quirks, battle strategies, and the aftermath of the encounters. In every instance, 𝐀𝐮 was either unscathed or had overwhelmed his opponents with relative ease. The system had flagged his quirk, muscle augmentation, as highly dangerous, marking it with a red warning, a stark indication of the threat he posed to those in the world. But to Izuku, it was inconsequential. Izuku accessed another window, this one dedicated to his real-time analysis tool. The data flowed in without interruption as his system automatically adjusted to the incoming information. He input the specifics of the current fight, hero quirks, 𝐀𝐮's unique abilities, environmental factors, and the position of each combatant, and watched as the numbers began flashing in rapid succession across the interface. Probability of the heroes winning, 60%. A relatively high chance, enough to make the outcome predictable. For Izuku, it was a simple statistic. There was no need for further consideration. The heroes were statistically likely to win, so there was no need to devote additional attention to the situation. With a thought, Izuku expanded his vision, opening a new array of windows. Instead of just tracking the events in the city, his feed now displayed a global view, energy flows, ongoing conflicts, disturbances, and activities from around the world, all categorized and processed seamlessly by his systems. Every piece of information from across the globe was now within his reach, each detail unfolding before him like an intricate web of interconnected events. The school day had finally come to an end. The streets around him seemed insignificant, merely the backdrop to his thoughts, which were consumed with his next project. Each step he took was deliberate, each movement precise, as he mentally mapped out every detail of his latest design. Calculations and simulations played out in his mind, refining each element before it even fully took shape. As he walked, his fingers absent-mindedly tapped against the surface of his watch. It responded instantly, the quiet hum of its activation blending into the background noise of the city. Within seconds, a series of translucent blue windows appeared in his peripheral vision. They hovered in the air, perfectly aligned with his line of sight. Each window displayed complex blueprints, algorithms, and data streams, updating in real time, adjusting to the minor changes his mind had already initiated. It barely had to say anything as the interface responded to his thoughts, expanding one window here, adjusting parameters there. Lines of code scrolled through his vision, running simulations faster than he could even process. The calculations flowed smoothly, the numbers and formulas aligning themselves in perfect harmony. But as he moved forward, something disrupted the constant flow of data. A fluctuation. A small anomaly caught his attention, flickering at the corner of his interface. Izuku's gaze shifted, narrowing on the source. It was an energy spike, sharp and sudden, a disturbance he recognized from earlier in the day. It had intensified, growing in both magnitude and frequency. Thermal readings surged. The disturbance wasn't just a fluctuation, it was the signature of combat. His system reprocessed the data, pulling up earlier readings from the same area. The energy readings matched the kind of chaos usually reserved for hero-villain encounters. The conflict was still ongoing. Izuku's steps faltered for a moment. His mind shifted gears. Without hesitation, he activated the teleportation sequence. The world around him blurred for an instant, then snapped back into focus. One moment he was walking along the city streets. The next, he was standing atop a tall building, looking down on the chaos below. From his vantage point, the scene was laid out like a high-stakes simulation. He watched, unmoving, as the two water-based heroes, Jetstream and Splash, lay unmoving on the ground. They had been defeated, their powers no match for the monster they had faced. Both heroes were sprawled across the pavement, unconscious or worse, their forms testament to the fight they had just endured. The villain, towering and monstrous, continued to dominate the battlefield. A hulking figure of raw power, his form constantly shifting as though made from liquid, he moved with terrifying fluidity. The battle had shifted, and now he was engaged with a new opponent. The new hero was faster than the first two, a blur of movement as they launched themselves at the villain, but even from this distance, Izuku could already calculate the odds. It was a futile effort. The villain's power far exceeded anything the new hero could bring to bear. It was over before it had even begun. Izuku's gaze never wavered, his mind analyzing the data in real time. He catalogued the villain's movements, tracking the battle's trajectory. In his mind, the numbers calculated the inevitable outcome. The villain would win. It was a foregone conclusion. Pathetic, Izuku muttered, his voice barely audible against the distant noise of destruction. His words were not spoken out of frustration or contempt. There was simply nothing to be gained from such battles. Even with the advantage of better statistics, even with superior resources, the heroes still faltered. Inefficient. Unnecessary. Izuku stood on the rooftop, his attention split between the battle below and the data streaming before him. His fingers lightly tapped against his watch, and blue windows appeared, displaying the chaos of the conflict. But his thoughts weren't consumed by the fight. His focus was on something else, testing the true extent of his abilities. His eyes flicked over the shifting energies, the villain's erratic movements, and the hero's disjointed attempts to contain the situation. Everything in this environment provided the kind of data he needed: uncertainty, chaos, and rapid shifts in strategy. Izuku adjusted his mental settings, processing the information at a speed far beyond ordinary human comprehension. His body felt the adjustments as his mind raced through possibilities, calculating the most efficient ways to apply his enhancements. It wasn't about testing how much the biomorphs could do, they were already beyond the realm of normality. What he was testing now was his own potential, the full range of abilities available to him in the heat of a real-time situation. As he prepared to move, a flicker of motion caught his attention from the corner of his eye. A figure approached the battlefield. Izuku had heard about her quirk, light manipulation. He knew the theory behind it, of course. It was a rare quirk, one that allowed its user to control and bend light, creating barriers, beams of energy, and other impressive feats. He had listened to his parents talk about it. Classmates had mentioned it too. Himari had even boasted about it a few times when they were in school, talking up how she could create blinding barriers and fire off beams of light that could slice through metal. But despite all that, Izuku had never seen her quirk in action. He hadn't needed to. Most of his time had been consumed by his work in the workshop, tinkering, upgrading, and testing out his own enhancements. He didn't attend many school events, nor did he watch much of the training or hero activity outside of what directly concerned him. Himari's boasts had always been just that, boasts. The kind of thing friends said to get attention or impress others. Now, however, he could finally see for himself whether the things she and their parents had boasted about were true or not. From the rooftop, Izuku observed Himari stepping onto the battlefield, her body crackling with light. The quirk she had always bragged about was now manifesting before his eyes, a steady stream of energy swirling around her as she rushed toward the villain. He had heard all the stories, her boasting, her parents' praise, the exaggerated claims. But now, for the first time, he saw the power in action. The light danced around her, illuminating the wreckage of the shattered city as she engaged the monstrous villain. Her movements were quick, purposeful, but there was a noticeable lack of control. The energy she manipulated was raw, untamed. He could see the potential, the strength, but it was still unrefined, unfinished. Izuku's gaze sharpened as he processed the scene before him. Her quirk is powerful, he thought, but the calculation was immediate. She can produce the light, but she doesn't have the control. If she had trained properly, maybe she could have stood a chance, but right now. He continued to observe her frantic movements. It's like giving a child the power to control a storm. A lot of raw power, but no understanding of how to wield it. Himari's attacks were wild, uncoordinated, as if the light itself was resisting her commands. She couldn't focus her energy, couldn't shape it to her will the way a more experienced fighter would. And with every failed strike, the flickering light around her began to dim, the strength draining from her. She wasn't the skilled hero she often claimed to be. Not yet. Izuku watched her falter, the glow of her power fading. Her form collapsed to the ground, her energy flickering out entirely. She had pushed herself beyond her limits, and now, it was over. His expression remained unreadable, still. He'd seen enough. Izuku descended from his elevated position, the wind whipping around him as he landed softly on the ground. Without hesitation, his fingers flicked across the holographic interface in front of him, opening multiple windows of data. Each display was filled with lines of code and complex systems, tracking everything that was happening on the battlefield. Goto, the villain standing across the field, caught sight of him. His mocking grin grew wider as he observed the newcomer. Well. Goto chuckled, flexing his bulging muscles. Another kid. They really don't have any heroes left. They send a kid to deal with me. Izuku didn't break stride. He walked steadily, his eyes locked on Goto with complete focus, his mind racing through data, analyzing the situation. Goto growled, narrowing his eyes at the calm boy before him. Listen up, kid. I'll give you one chance to walk away, Goto warned, his voice dripping with disdain. Turn around and run, and I won't hurt you. Just leave. But Izuku kept walking, his pace unhurried. His gaze never wavered from the villain. Goto's lips curled into a snarl. You're asking for it, he roared. In an instant, Goto launched himself forward with inhuman speed, his massive fists aimed straight at Izuku's chest. The punch was powerful enough to break through steel, and for a moment, it seemed like there was no way for Izuku to avoid the attack. But he didn't move, he didn't need to. Goto's fist was suddenly thrown off course as a burst of energy surged through the air, propelling him violently to the left. Goto crashed into the ground with a grunt, rolling several feet before coming to a stop. Izuku, unbothered by the villain's attack, continued walking towards Himari as if nothing had happened. His hand moved, pressing a few more buttons in the air. A series of small drones emerged from his watch and scattered across the battlefield with precision, their metallic bodies glinting in the sunlight. Goto regained his footing, eyes blazing with anger. He roared, his muscles expanding, and charged at Izuku once more. But Izuku didn't flinch. He moved deliberately, stepping in front of Himari as the drones buzzed overhead, diving straight towards her. Within seconds, the drones hovered above Himari. Their glowing blue lights flickered as they hovered over her, and within moments, the drones began emitting a soft, healing pulse. Her wounds, deep and grievous only moments ago, healed in an instant. Her breath steadied, and her once pale face regained color. Izuku remained completely focused, his eyes scanning the rest of the battlefield. He noticed that the other heroes, those who had been scattered in various states of injury across the field, had all been healed and gathered together. The drones had efficiently moved them into a pile, working in tandem to stabilize their conditions. They were no longer in immediate danger. Turning his gaze back to Goto, Izuku saw the villain charging forward, fists raised in fury. The gap between them closed quickly, and Izuku didn't move a muscle. Suddenly, a soft noise broke through the tension in the air. Izuku's sharp senses caught the sound, and he turned his head slightly to notice Himari stirring behind him. Her eyelids fluttered open, her pupils adjusting to the world around her. The soft gasp of air escaping her lips signaled the return of her consciousness. Izuku's gaze lingered on her for a moment, but his focus quickly returned to the front. As the villain closed the distance between them, the villain's eyes were filled with nothing but rage, his expression twisted in fury. The air around them seemed to crackle with tension as the villain, his muscles coiled tight, reared his fist back. With a guttural growl, he moved his fist toward Izuku's face. But just as it was about to make contact, the punch froze mid-air, stopping inches from Izuku's skin. The villain's eyes widened in disbelief. His arm quivered, and for a brief moment he seemed to question what was happening. He yanked his fist back, readying himself for another strike. His brow furrowed, his teeth gritting in frustration. Without giving Izuku a moment to respond, the villain swung again. This time, his fist came in faster, fueled by a rising anger, but once more, it halted just before hitting Izuku's face. The villain, now more desperate, started throwing punches in rapid succession. His movements became erratic, filled with nothing but raw rage. Each blow was more powerful than the last, each punch desperate to land anything on Izuku. His skin began to tear and split from the excessive force of his own strikes. Blood dripped down his arms, staining the ground beneath him as he desperately tried again and again, his rage building. The villain's arm muscles bulged grotesquely with the effort, and veins threatened to burst as his skin broke down from the intense force he exerted. But no matter how hard he hit, his fists couldn't reach Izuku. Izuku stood there motionless, his expression calm, as though he were simply observing a child's tantrum. The relentless barrage continued until, after what felt like an eternity, the villain slowed. His breaths were ragged, his face flushed with the combination of exhaustion and anger. His hands were raw, bleeding, and shredded. Izuku's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Looks like that's as far as you can go." Without a moment's hesitation, Izuku raised his hand, his fingers curling slightly. Then he snapped his fingers. The resulting shockwave exploded outward, sending a powerful wave of force rushing through the air. The impact hit the villain like a freight train, sending him crashing backward. The villain's body was propelled several feet, tumbling and rolling violently across the ground before finally coming to a stop in a crumpled heap. When he stopped moving, it was clear that his body had been utterly destroyed. His limbs were twisted unnaturally, and his bones jutted out from his skin at odd angles. His chest caved in, and blood pooled around him as his body appeared utterly broken and lifeless. Yet there was no sign of death, just grotesque and unnatural damage. Izuku glanced down at his hand, flexing his fingers casually as though the entire event had been nothing more than a passing inconvenience. He didn't seem bothered by the destruction at all. "Looks like I've overestimated the durability of a quirk user," he muttered, inspecting his hand with mild curiosity. With a flick of his wrist, he activated one of his drones, which floated smoothly toward the villain. The drone emitted a soft hum as it hovered over the villain's broken form. A faint pulse of energy radiated from the drone, enveloping the villain's body. Slowly, his wounds began to mend, the flesh knitting back together, though it was clear to Izuku that this was only part of the experiment. Suddenly, Izuku felt a soft, unexpected pressure on his shoulder. He turned to find Himari standing there, her wide eyes filled with confusion and concern. Her body was trembling slightly, still recovering from the shock of everything she had witnessed. "Izuku." Her voice cracked, uncertainty lacing her words. But before she could finish, Izuku cut her off, his tone sharp and impersonal. "I'm busy." His voice was as cold as ice, and without giving her another glance, he turned his back to her, fully focused on the villain now healing before him. Himari's hand hovered in the air as if she were about to reach out to him, but she hesitated, the words caught in her throat. Himari stood there for a moment, feeling an unsettling chill in the air, before she turned away, her mind racing. She looked around, her eyes landing on the scattered bodies of several pro-heroes just a few feet away. Their bodies were scattered like discarded toys, and yet, their injuries seemed to have vanished. No cuts, no bruises, no broken bones. They looked healed just like her. Confusion racked her mind. If their injuries were healed, then why weren't they awake? She ran to them, shaking them desperately. She shouted their names, her voice a mixture of panic and disbelief, but the heroes didn't stir. They remained lifeless, their eyes closed as if they were merely sleeping. Her hands trembled as she shook them harder, but no response came. Around the corner of her vision, Himari spotted something strange. A police car, its lights flashing in the dim light of the evening, sat motionless in the street. The sirens were silent, the lights casting a pale, unnatural glow against the surrounding stillness. At first, she couldn't quite make sense of it. Why was it parked in the middle of the road like that? But the more she looked, the more she realized something was horribly wrong. There was no sound, no movement. The entire scene felt frozen, like the world itself had pressed pause. Himari's heart skipped a beat, and a cold shiver ran down her spine. She began walking toward the car, her footsteps hesitant, as though the ground itself was resisting her movement. The closer she got, the more unsettling the scene became. The car wasn't just parked, it was completely still, locked in time, unmoving in a way that defied logic. The world around it seemed unnaturally quiet, the silence pressing in on her from every side. There wasn't a single sound in the air, not even the usual hum of the city or the distant murmur of traffic. Everything had simply stopped. As she drew closer to the police car, Himari's breath quickened. She couldn't see much through the tinted windows, but she could make out the faint outlines of the officers inside. At first, she thought they were simply parked and waiting. But as she came even closer, the truth became impossible to ignore. The officers weren't just sitting still, they were frozen. Their faces were locked in expressions of shock, their eyes wide, mouths slightly open, as though they'd been caught in a moment of disbelief, yet none of them were moving. Their hands were still gripping the steering wheel, perfectly still, as though time had decided to stop for them alone. Himari's steps faltered as the weight of what she was seeing pressed down on her chest. She reached out, almost as if to touch the car, but stopped herself. She couldn't explain it, but the air felt thick, like it was holding its breath. The whole world seemed to be holding its breath. Her legs moved almost involuntarily as she rounded the corner of the police car, her gaze moving toward the road ahead. That's when she saw it, more cars. They stretched out behind the first police vehicle, each one as motionless as the last. The scene was even more disorienting now, because it wasn't just one car that had stopped. It was everything. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Time itself, had stopped. Her body, once in motion, suddenly came to a complete standstill. Her heartbeat didn't race, nor did her thoughts spiral in panic, everything simply halted. She tried to turn toward Izuku, but before she could move, her body froze, locked in place just like everything around her. She took a step, then another, but neither felt natural. By the time she reached the next step, she was motionless, her limbs stiff, her body completely still. There was no struggle, no sensation of being held back. She was simply frozen, her movements stopped in time with Himari frozen in time. Izuku turned back toward the villain, his gaze unwavering as Goto, now fully healed, pushed himself off the ground. Izuku's expression remained emotionless, his voice cold as he addressed the villain. "Now that all the distractions are gone," he said, turning to face Goto, "let's start the real experiment." Goto gasped as he rose from the ground, his massive frame shuddering with each breath, as if the weight of his own body were an unfamiliar burden. The pain that had racked him mere moments ago was completely gone, vanished without a trace. His hands, which had trembled with the agony of broken bones and shattered organs, now clenched and unclenched, feeling a raw, unfiltered strength coursing through them. But there was an odd emptiness that lingered in his chest. He remembered dying. The crushing sensation of his body breaking apart, the darkness swallowing him whole, the sensation of his very soul being torn from his body. Yet here he was, whole again, standing on the scarred battlefield as though nothing had happened. He looked down at his hands, the reminder of his resurrection, but nothing made sense anymore. His eyes snapped to Izuku, who stood calmly several meters away. The cold, impassive look on his face only fueled Goto's rage. "What the hell did you do to me?" Goto growled, his voice thick with frustration. His eyes burned with fury, his jaw clenched tight as he glared at Izuku, who stood with an unflinching calm. Izuku tilted his head ever so slightly, his fingers gently tapping against the holographic interface projected from his watch. It hummed softly, the symbols on the screen shifting with a quiet precision. "You almost died from that," he said, his voice cold and clinical, devoid of any emotion. "Didn't know you were that weak." The insult was like a flame to Goto's already boiling rage. His eyes narrowed, a low, guttural growl escaping his throat as his fists clenched tighter, his veins bulging. He charged forward, the earth cracking beneath his feet as his enormous body rushed at Izuku. His fist came swinging forward with such speed and strength that the air itself seemed to ripple around it. Izuku did not flinch. He simply stood there, watching Goto's charge as though it were a slow-motion scene in a movie. His eyes narrowed ever so slightly, and with a casual motion, his right hand lifted in the air, his fingers forming the shape of a gun, aimed directly at Goto. The world seemed to hold its breath. Izuku's hand remained outstretched, his fingers tense as though he were waiting for a precise moment. The air around him began to crackle. Slowly, a small blue sphere began to form at the tips of his outstretched fingers, its surface shifting, pulsing with raw power. With a slight flick of his wrist, the sphere shot forward, moving with such velocity that it seemed to disappear from view before Goto even had time to react. The sphere collided with Goto before he could get any closer to Izuku. The sound was deafening. The shockwave that erupted from the impact was so intense that it sent a ripple through the very air itself, creating a powerful gust that swept across the battlefield. The force of the explosion obliterated Goto's body in an instant, the upper half of his torso simply ceasing to exist. The shockwave tore through the surrounding area, sending debris, vehicles, and structures flying into the air as though they were mere toys. Buildings crumbled in an instant, reduced to rubble, and roads were shattered. A massive swath of destruction extended for miles, the horizon barely visible through the dust and smoke rising from the devastation. Izuku stood unmoving amidst the chaos. His expression remained unchanged as he glanced down at his watch, making a few quick adjustments. He didn't even look at the destruction. A small drone buzzed to life nearby, hovering over the remains of what had once been Goto. It emitted a soft pulse of energy, and Goto's shattered form began to rebuild itself. Izuku's cold gaze never wavered as he continued to observe the process. The drone's pulse resonated through the air as Goto's body slowly began to reform. His bones clicked back into place with a sickening crack. His skin pulled itself together, knitting from the edges toward the center. In a matter of seconds, Goto was standing once more, whole and uninjured, though visibly shaken. He gasped for breath, still trying to process. What had just occurred? Izuku's gaze remained fixed on him, unwavering. "How do you feel?" he asked, his voice monotone. "How does it feel to die and come back?" Goto's chest heaved, his body trembling from the aftereffects of what had just transpired. He should have been dead. His body had been torn apart, but now here he stood, whole once more, in a state he could not understand. The feeling of being brought back from death was unnatural, terrifying. Yet his fury only burned brighter. He could not show weakness. Not now. Not in front of this child. Without a word, Goto roared in frustration, his anger boiling over. He lunged once more, his enormous body charging toward Izuku. His fist came barreling down, aimed squarely for Izuku's head. His movements were swift, a blur of motion as he launched himself with all his might. But once again, Izuku did not move. Izuku raised his hand, fingers poised, and again, Goto's attack was halted, stopped mid-motion as if some invisible force had caught him in midair. The power holding him was tangible, pressing down on his body with an oppressive force. Goto's entire body tensed as he struggled against it, but he couldn't move. Izuku sighed, the sound laced with impatience. "I believe I asked you a question." He didn't wait for a response. Izuku tapped Goto's outstretched fist with the tip of his finger. The hum that followed was low and deep, vibrating through the ground itself. Goto's body began to swell grotesquely, his muscles expanding at a rapid rate. His skin stretched tight as if it couldn't contain the sheer force of his growing frame. His veins bulged, a network of them running like angry rivers beneath his skin, and the tension in his body was unbearable. The force of the explosion was so violent that it sent pieces of Goto's shredded body flying in every direction. Blood, organs, and muscles splattered across the battlefield, the once pristine ground now soaked in crimson. Izuku stood motionless, his expression remained unchanged as he surveyed the devastation around him. Another pulse of energy from the drone, and once again, Goto's body began to reform. The bones, broken and shattered, clicked back into place, and his body was slowly reassembled, each piece coming together with an unsettling efficiency. In seconds, Goto was standing once more, gasping for breath as though nothing had happened. Izuku's voice broke the silence, cold and unfeeling. "Are you ready to answer my question yet?" Goto's mind raced, trying to process the impossible. His body had been destroyed twice, yet here he was, alive, standing before the boy who seemed utterly unaffected by the devastation he had unleashed. His fury reached a boiling point. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears as he lunged again, every muscle in his body screaming with the need for revenge. His enormous hands shot forward, reaching out to crush Izuku's skull in his grip. "Die, you piece of 𝐀𝐮𝐭𝐡𝐨𝐫," he bellowed, his voice filled with a ferocity that shook the air itself. His fingers closed around Izuku's head, squeezing with a strength that could pulverize stone. The pressure was immediate, and the world seemed to grow still for a moment as Goto's grip tightened. He could feel the bones of Izuku's skull give way beneath his fingers, the fragile structure bending under the force. The sickening sound of cracking bone echoed through the air as Goto applied more pressure. Izuku's body was limp in his hands, lifeless, like a broken doll. The boy's skull buckled, splintering under the pressure. But Goto didn't stop. He squeezed harder. His palms pressed in, forcing Izuku's head to buckle even more. The sickening sound of bones snapping filled the air, louder now, as if a dam was about to break. But then, the skull couldn't hold any longer. With an explosive pop, Izuku's head exploded. The force of Goto's grip shattered it completely, the skull disintegrating like brittle glass under the crushing pressure. Blood, bone, and brain matter erupted outward, splattering across Goto's hands and the surrounding battlefield in a violent spray. The sheer intensity of the explosion sent shards of bone flying, creating a grotesque hailstorm of gore. The warm, sickly sensation flooded Goto's palms as he felt the remains of the boy's skull break apart under his grip, turning Izuku's head into little more than a mangled mess of shattered bone and wet, pulpy tissue. Izuku's body slumped instantly, lifeless and crumpled in Goto's grasp, the remains of his skull still stuck between Goto's fingers. The blood was thick and slick, dripping from his hands in a crimson cascade. The boy's ruined head was nothing more than a broken, mangled mass of flesh and bone, unrecognizable as anything human. The rush of triumph surged through Goto's chest. He had finally won. The boy was dead, utterly destroyed. There was no way he could have survived this. He stood over the crumpled remains of Izuku's body, his hands slick with blood and gore, a sense of dark satisfaction filling him. But then, just as the thrill of victory began to settle in, something broke through the haze of his triumph. Flawless. The voice was cold, distant, detached, like the sound of a perfect, unfeeling machine. It cut through the air with sharp precision, causing Goto's heart to seize in his chest. His eyes shot open in horror, the words echoing in his mind like a cruel mockery. He turned quickly, his body stiff with disbelief, but there, standing behind him, completely unharmed, was Izuku. Izuku stood still, his expression unreadable, his arms crossed in calm indifference. Not a single drop of blood, not a mark on his body. Not even a trace of the brutal destruction Goto had just wrought. Goto's mind reeled. His gaze flicked back to where Izuku's body should have been. He could still see the remnants of what he had done, the headless corpse, slumped lifeless on the ground. It was there, but it felt like it belonged to someone else, as if it wasn't the same person who had been standing before him just moments ago. Izuku was right behind him, a ghost, an impossible phantom. Goto stumbled backward in pure disbelief, his heart thundering in his chest, his legs shaking as he tried to comprehend what was happening. "What the hell are you?" he gasped, his voice trembling as fear began to creep into the pit of his stomach. Izuku's gaze never wavered. He didn't answer, didn't even acknowledge the question. His eyes were calm, focused, unconcerned. Before Goto could even begin to process the sight in front of him, his body suddenly seized. Pain shot through his body like an electric current, the sensation of heat and pressure overwhelming his senses. A roar of agony ripped from his throat as he staggered back. Then, the flames. Without warning, fire erupted around him, as though the very air had caught alight. Goto's flesh burned instantly, the heat so intense that it felt like his very bones were being melted. His skin blackened, curling and cracking like dry paper in a fire. The searing flames tore through his clothes, his muscles, as though every inch of him was being consumed by a ravenous force. His body twisted and writhed in agony, every movement seeming to intensify the pain as the flames clung to him. There was no escape. His screams echoed across the battlefield, a guttural, soul-wrenching sound that resonated deep within the air. His eyes watered, but the tears only served to make the pain sharper. It felt as if the fire was burning away everything that made him who he was, leaving only the raw, unfeeling core of his being. Izuku stood motionless, watching the inferno with cold, detached indifference. His face was a blank canvas, his eyes reflecting none of the emotion that should have accompanied such an intense display of destruction. The fire continued to consume Goto with brutal efficiency, spreading across his body, liquefying his muscles, and stripping him of his very identity. Goto's screams grew weaker, his movements more erratic, but still the flames held him in their grasp, a relentless force of nature that would not release him. His hands reached out, clawing at the air, trying in vain to stop the fire, but it was useless. The heat was unbearable, and soon his screams died to a hollow rasp. His body gave one final, desperate twitch before collapsing into a heap, a smoldering, charred remnant of the man he had once been. The flames flickered out, leaving behind only a dark, ash-covered form, the last traces of his humanity nothing more than a pile of burned flesh. The battlefield fell silent once again, the only sound the faint crackling of the lingering embers in the air, the acrid stench of burnt flesh heavy in the atmosphere. Izuku stood motionless for a moment, his eyes fixed on the remains of Goto. His expression was unreadable, as if the gruesome sight before him held no significance. He let out a quiet, almost indifferent sigh. "I guess that's as far as he could handle," he murmured. A heavy silence fell over the battlefield, the air thick with the aftermath of destruction. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then, as if the carnage had been a mere fleeting thought, Izuku's gaze shifted downward, and his focus turned inward. His hand, still clenched at his side, began to glow, a deep, intense crimson that flickered like embers. Slowly, he raised his hand into the air, the light growing brighter with each passing second. His fingers twitched slightly, and then, without a hint of hesitation, he turned his wrist in a counterclockwise motion. Reality itself bent to his will. The world around him rippled as the fabric of reality twisted. The destruction that had once torn through the city evaporated in an instant, leaving no trace behind. Crumbling buildings, shattered streets, and broken debris, everything that had been ravaged by the battle was reversed, as if someone had pressed the reset button. The once charred and desolate city returned to its pristine state, untouched by the violence that had recently gripped it. Roads were whole, buildings stood tall and intact, and the very air seemed to hold its breath in suspended animation. Izuku's gaze drifted to Himari, who stood frozen in place, caught within the looping flow of time that he had created. He walked toward her with calm, measured steps, the world around him holding still in reverence of his control. His fingers brushed the buttons on his watch, each press deliberate, and with a soft chime, the world snapped back into its normal rhythm. Himari blinked, her body jerking as though waking from a deep slumber. Ari started, but she stopped short when she saw him standing right in front of her. Her breath caught, and her eyes widened. "Whoa," she breathed, unable to process the shock of the moment. "Wait, if you're here, then where is the villain?" Izuku's voice was flat, monotone. "Don't you remember? You took care of him." Himari's brow furrowed, her thoughts spinning. What are you talking about?" She stumbled back a step, her confusion deepening. She could still remember being knocked out by the villain, Izuku coming in to save her, not whatever the hell he was saying. Izuku didn't respond immediately. Instead, he raised a hand, a gesture that interrupted her confused questions. He tapped a few more buttons on his watch, and a holographic screen flickered to life in the air between them. The blue light cast a soft glow on their faces as the screen began to play a video, a recording. The footage showed her. It was a scene from the battle, but this time, Himari was the one in control. She was overwhelming Goto with calculated precision, her every movement a testament to years of training and relentless determination. The image shifted, showing her cornering him, her strikes leaving him with no room to escape. There was no hesitation in her actions. She was ruthless. Goto, battered and broken, was forced into a final, desperate attempt to flee, but he couldn't. Himari was there, stopping him cold, her presence commanding the situation. Himari stared at the screen in disbelief, her breath caught in her throat. "When did I do that?" Her voice trembled slightly, her brow furrowing as confusion overtook her. "Izuku, what is all of this?" Izuku remained silent for a moment, his gaze cold and distant. He didn't offer an immediate response, but his eyes met hers, his gaze intense, yet emotionless. Himari's heart raced as the pieces of the puzzle seemed to slip further out of reach. "Izuku," she began again, her voice unsteady. "First off, if you have such a powerful quirk, why didn't you said anything about it? Why didn't you tell Mom and Dad? Why did you dash?" "It's not a quirk," Izuku said flatly, his voice devoid of any inflection. "What?" Himari's voice rose in disbelief, an edge of frustration creeping into her words. "You expect me to believe that? Since the villain is not here, I would like to assume ran away, meaning you most likely defeated the villain, healed the life-threatening injuries I and those heroes over there had, and you can even stop time." She took a step toward him, her eyes narrowing, her heart pounding as the weight of the impossible situation pressed down on her. "And after seeing all of this, you expect me to believe you don't have a quirk? Then don't," Izuku said flatly, his voice as neutral as ever. Without waiting for her response, he shifted his gaze toward his watch, fingers tapping against it with a mechanical precision. The quiet hum of the device seemed to fill the air as he pressed a few buttons. The casual indifference of his tone made her stomach churn. It was as though the weight of everything, the battles, the danger, the answers she desperately needed, meant nothing to him. Himari's fists clenched at her sides, her mind reeling. "Izuku," she snapped, stepping forward. Her voice trembled with a mixture of confusion and anger, the frustration bubbling to the surface. "I asked you some 𝐀𝐮𝐿." Before she could finish, he interrupted her, his voice cutting through her words like a blade. "Anyway, good luck." Hearing that response, Himari's brows furrowed in confusion. "Good luck? What do you mean, good luck?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The words slipped out before she could stop them, her mind struggling to grasp the meaning behind his indifferent tone. Hearing the question, Izuku simply points behind her. She whipped around, her eyes widening as she saw All Might striding toward her, his usual heroic confidence replaced by a look of concern. His brow was furrowed, and his normally unwavering posture was now tinged with urgency. Behind him, a mass of reporters surged forward, their cameras flashing and voices clamoring for attention. Himari's heart raced, her mind struggling to catch up with the situation. "Wait, when did you?" she started, but the words faltered in her throat. In the midst of her confusion, she turned to finish her sentence, but suddenly froze. Her gaze swept the area, her eyes desperately searching for Izuku. But he was nowhere to be seen. Himari's breath quickened, panic creeping into her chest. She scanned the crowd, her heart pounding as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. He couldn't have just disappeared, could he? Turning back to All Might, she opened her mouth to say something, but before she could speak, the towering hero wrapped his arms around her in a sudden, protective hug. "Are you okay?" All Might's voice was thick with concern. He pulled back slightly, his hands gently scanning her arms, checking for any signs of injury. "Did you get hurt?" Himari blinked, still trying to process everything. The reporters, sensing a shift in the situation, swarmed around her, their cameras flashing relentlessly. Their questions came at her from all angles, a blur of noise that she couldn't quite make sense of. As the chaos unfolded around her, Himari's eyes darted across the scene, trying to make sense of what had just happened. That's when she saw him. A figure standing atop a building in the distance, his silhouette barely visible against the sky. Izuku. He stood still, his gaze fixed on the crowd surrounding her and All Might. For a moment, their eyes seemed to lock from across the distance. Then, Izuku once again glanced down at his watch and pressed a button and vanished again.